Middle-earth holds more than mountains and rivers. It carries the echoes of forgotten ages. I am your keeper of ancient knowledge, sharing the deeper lore that illuminates even the darkest mysteries. Welcome to the Untold Stories.
In the days when shadow first stirred in the eastern lands, and the white tree of Gondor bore pale blooms beneath a dimming sky, there came a time of testing that would mark the hearts of men for generations yet unborn. The great river Anduin flowed as it had since the world was young, carrying upon its waters both the memory of ancient glory and the whisper of coming doom. Osgiliath, the proud citadel of kings, stood divided as a wound upon the heart of the realm. Once had this city been the crown of Gondor's might, its great dome catching the first light of dawn and holding it like a jewel against the darkness. Now the eastern half lay in ruin, claimed by shadow and given over to the creatures that shun the light of sun and moon alike. The river ran between the halves like a silver sword, and upon its bridges the guards of Gondor kept their lonely watch. It was in the 41st year of Denethor's rule, as ruling steward, that the darkness began to gather with purpose, renewed. The steward had grown strange in those days. His mind turned ever toward the palantir that burned like a cold fire in the highest tower of the citadel. His elder son, Boromir, had ridden north with the 9 walkers on a quest whose end none could foresee. Yet it was Faramir, the younger son, who bore the weight of defending the realm's eastern borders. Captain of the Rangers of Ithilien, Prince of Dol Amroth by his mother's line, Faramir, son of Denethor, stood upon the western walls of Osgiliath as the autumn wind carried strange scents from the lands beyond the river. Tall he was, and fair of face, with the grey eyes of his line and hair dark as the wing of the raven. But it was not his bearing that marked him as noble, though noble he was, but rather the wisdom that sat upon him like a mantle, hard won through years of ranging in the wild places where the shadow had long held sway. The sun was sinking toward the western mountains, painting the broken stones of the eastern city in shades of gold and crimson. From where he stood, Faramir could see the great bridge that had once carried the kings of old between the 2 halves of their capital. Now it was shattered, its stones lying tumbled in the dark waters below, and only a narrow span remained, guarded day and night by the most trusted of his men. "My lord," came a voice at his shoulder, and Faramir turned to see Mablung, his lieutenant, approaching with the measured tread of one who brings news of weight. Dark was Mablung's face, weathered by long years in the service of Gondor, and his hand rested ever upon the hilt of his sword. "What word from the borders?" Faramir asked, though he read much already in his companion's bearing. "The scouts have returned from the crossroads, my lord. They speak of movement in Morgul Vale, and of fires burning where no fires have burned for many years. The very air grows thick with malice, and the birds flee westward as if driven by some great fear." Faramir nodded, his eyes returning to the darkening east. He had felt it himself in recent days, a wrongness in the wind, a shadow upon the heart that spoke of ancient evil stirring. The Rangers of Ithilien had long held their secret ways through the lost gardens beyond the river, striking at the enemy's servants and retreating before superior numbers could be brought to bear. But now the very land seemed to rebel against their presence, as if some malevolent will had awakened to bend all things to its purpose. "Double the watch upon the river," he commanded. "Let no craft cross unobserved, be it but a fallen log carried by the current. And send word to Captain Anborn. I would have him bring his company back from the Imin Arnen. The time for ranging far afield draws to a close." As Mablung departed to carry out his orders, Faramir remained upon the wall, watching as the last light faded from the eastern sky. Above, the stars began to kindle, cold and distant, and among them rode the moon, pale as the face of one long dead. The river murmured its eternal song below, carrying away the detritus of the day and bearing it toward the sea. in the gathering darkness, memory stirred unbidden in the prince's mind. He thought of his father's face, drawn and lined with care, and of the weight that pressed ever more heavily upon the steward's shoulders. He thought of Boromir, bold and proud, riding to horizons unknown. And he thought of words spoken long ago by one whose wisdom was deeper than the wells of Khazad-dûm, words about the nature of hope and the strength that lies hidden in the hearts of the seemingly weak. From the eastern ruins came no sound but the wind through broken stone. Yet Faramir felt watched, as a deer might feel the gaze of the hunter. Somewhere in that maze of fallen towers and shattered halls, eyes that loved not the light were turned westward. The enemy was patient, as only the immortal could be patient, but patience was not inaction. Even now, in the darkness beyond sight, the shadow was gathering its strength. The Prince of Ithilien drew his cloak about his shoulders and made his way down from the wall. In the hall below, his captains waited with maps and reports, and there was much to be done before the dawn. But as he walked, Faramir carried with him the certainty that change was coming, change as vast and terrible as the tide of the sea, and as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. Behind him, the wind rose, rattling the shutters of the garrison house, and setting the banners to snapping like the wings of caged birds. And from somewhere far to the east, too faint for mortal ears to hear, there came the sound of drums. 3 days passed after the drums first echoed from the eastern darkness, and with each dawn, the shadows seemed to deepen rather than retreat before the light. Faramir walked the gardens of Ithilien in the grey hour before sunrise, treading paths that his rangers had carved through wilderness reclaimed. Here, where once the lords of Gondor had taken their pleasure among roses and fountains, now only the hardiest of men dared venture, and even they went cloaked and with weapons ready. Yet there was beauty still in these forgotten places, a beauty made more poignant by its peril. The trees had grown wild and tall, reaching toward a sky they seldom glimpsed clearly through the canopy above. Streams ran silver between moss-covered stones, and flowers bloomed in secret glades where the deer came to drink in the uncertain safety of twilight. It was a beauty that spoke of older days, when the world was younger and the dominion of evil had not yet cast its pall across so fair a land. As he walked, Faramir's mind turned to the reports that had reached him in the night. Strange tales they were, brought by shepherds fleeing from the borders of Emin Arnon, and by merchants who had abandoned their goods rather than face whatever darkness pursued them from the south. They spoke of trees that moved when no wind stirred their branches, of voices calling in languages forgotten since the elder days, and of a great sadness that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. The prince paused beside a pool where water lilies floated like fallen stars upon the dark surface. Above him, an ancient oak spread its arms wide, its trunk scarred by lightning and years beyond counting. It was here, in the deepest part of the garden, that the strangest tale had reached him, a tale that troubled his thoughts like a half-remembered dream. An old woman had come to the gates of Osgiliath 3 nights past, bent with age and wearing robes that seemed woven from mist and starlight. She claimed to be of the folk of Lebanon, though she spoke with an accent none could place, and her eyes held depths that seemed older than the stones of the city. Before the guards could question her further, she had vanished like smoke upon the wind, leaving only words that echoed strangely in the memory. The trees remember what men have forgotten. In the hour of greatest need, the voices of the earth shall speak again, and the children of Yavanna shall answer the call of their ancient grief. Faramir had dismissed the tale at first as the ramblings of one touched by hardship and fear. Yet now, standing in the green silence of the garden, he found himself listening, truly listening, to the sounds that surrounded him. The rustle of leaves spoke in cadences that seemed almost like words, and the creaking of branches carried melodies that tugged at something deep within his heart. It was then that he heard it, a sound so faint that for a moment he thought it might be only the sighing of wind through distant boughs. But as he strained his ears, the sound grew clearer, and with it came a certainty that chilled him to the bone. Somewhere in the depths of the forest, something was singing. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but partook of all these qualities and none. It rose and fell, like the sound of water over stone, and in its depths lay a sorrow so profound that tears started unbidden to Faramir's eyes. The language was unknown to him, yet somehow he understood its meaning. A lament for things lost, for gardens made desolate, for the children of the forest who had walked into shadow and never returned. Slowly, as if drawn by chains he could not see, Faramir began to walk toward the sound. His hand moved of its own accord to rest upon the hilt of his sword, though what weapon could avail against such grief as filled that voice, he could not say. Deeper into the garden he went, following paths that seemed to shift and change beneath his feet, until he came at last to a glade he had never seen before. In the center of the clearing stood a tree greater than any he had ever beheld, an Entwife, though he knew not how that knowledge came to him. Her bark was silver white, shot through with veins of green and gold, and her branches reached toward the sky like arms raised in supplication. From somewhere within her ancient form came the voice he had heard, and as he watched, her leaves began to shimmer and dance, though no wind stirred the air. "Long have I waited," she said, and now her words rang clear as bells in the morning air, for one to come who might understand. "Long have I kept my vigil here, while my sisters walked into the west, and my brothers slept the deep sleep of stone and root. But the time of awakening draws near, young prince, and the earth itself cries out for aid." Faramir found his voice, though it seemed to come from very far away. "What aid can mortal men give to one such as you, who has seen the rise and fall of kingdoms uncounted?" The Entwife's laughter was like the sound of rain on new leaves. "Greater than you know is the power that flows in the blood of Numenor, though diminished by the years. But it is not power of arm that I seek, but rather the wisdom to listen and the courage to act when the moment comes. For even now, in the halls of Isengard and the pits of Barad-dûr, machines of war turn against the green growing things, and ancient hatred stirs to make all the world a desert." As she spoke, images flickered through Faramir's mind, visions of forests burning, of rivers running black with ash, of the very stones crying out in anguish as the shadow spread its dominion over all things fair and free. He saw armies of orcs and wolves descending from the mountains, and felt the earth tremble beneath the weight of their malice. "What would you have me do?" he asked, and his voice was steady, though his heart quailed at what he had seen. "Remember," the Entwife said simply. "Remember that the world is wider than the kingdoms of men, and older than their wars. Remember that in the darkest hour, there are allies to be found in places where few would think to look. And when the time comes, as come it will, ere many days have passed, remember that the smallest deed may turn the tide of the Khazit-Dadab greatest battle." Even as she spoke, the tree began to fade, becoming translucent as morning mist. Yet her voice remained, growing ever more distant but no less clear. "I go now to wake my sisters, who sleep in hidden groves. The Ents march to war, young prince, as they have not marched since the world was young. See that you are ready when the storm breaks, for on that day the fate of all free peoples shall hang in the balance." The glade was empty now, save for the ordinary trees that had always grown there, and the sound of running water over stone. Yet Faramir stood long in that place, his mind reeling with all he had heard and seen. At length, he turned and made his way back through the garden paths, his steps heavy with the weight of prophecy. Behind him, though he knew it not. The leaves of every tree stirred as he passed, and from their depths came a whisper that followed him all the way back to the walls of Osgiliath. The trees remember all. Far from the gardens of Ithilien, where the morning mist still clung to the memory of ancient words, a lone rider spurred his horse through the wild lands that lay between the rivers. The beast beneath him was no common mount, but Shadowfax, the lord of all horses, whose hoofbeats rang like silver bells upon the wind, and whose speed was swifter than the flight of eagles. Upon his back sat one whom many knew by different names in different lands, Gandalf the Grey to some, Mithrandir to others, but to those who knew him best, simply the Grey Pilgrim who walked the roads of Middle-earth in the service of causes greater than any one kingdom or people. The wizard's face was grave beneath the wide brim of his weather-beaten hat, and his eyes held the light of one who has seen far and looked deep into matters that trouble the heart. For 3 days and nights he had ridden without rest, driven by an urgency that grew stronger with each passing hour. The wind brought him tidings from the east, scents of smoke and ash, the acrid tang of sorcery, and beneath it all, a wrongness that spoke of ancient evils stirring in places where they should have remained forever bound. Behind him lay the borders of Rohan, where he had taken counsel with Erkenbrand and the other lords of the Mark. Dark news had he brought them, and darker still were the tidings they had given in return. Wolves ran in packs greater than any seen in living memory, and the Dunlendings spoke in hushed voices of lights in the sky and voices calling from the barrows of their ancestors. Even the horses, wise as they were in the ways of the wild, grew restless and turned their heads ever toward the south, as if sensing some great storm approaching from that quarter. Now Gandalf rode the ancient paths that led toward Gondor, following roads that had been old when the kings of Numenor first set foot upon these shores. The land about him bore the scars of long warfare, yet still there was beauty to be found for those who had eyes to see it. The grass grew green beside the streams, and in the distance the peaks of the White Mountains rose like pillars supporting the sky itself. Here and there, groves of trees offered shade to the weary traveller, and flowers bloomed in the meadows where the cattle of the Mark grazed in times of peace. But peace was a fragile thing in these latter days, and Gandalf read in every sign about him the approach of trials that would test the courage of all free peoples. The very air seemed charged with possibility, as it is before the breaking of a great storm, and in the depths of his heart, the wizard felt the stirring of powers that had slept since the elder days. It was as the sun reached its zenith that Shadowfax began to falter in his stride, not from weariness, for the great horse was beyond such mortal frailties, but from something else entirely. His ears pricked forward and his nostrils flared as he tested the wind. For a moment he stood perfectly still, every muscle tensed, and then he let out a whinny that echoed across the empty landscape like a clarion call. Gandalf laid a gentle hand upon the horse's neck, feeling the tremor that ran through the noble beast's frame. "What is it, my friend?" he murmured. "What do you sense that I cannot?" In answer, Shadowfax turned his head toward the east, toward the distant line of hills that marked the borders of Ithilien. There, where the eye could barely make out the shape of ancient towers against the sky, something flickered, a light that was not the sun, brief as lightning, yet cold as the light of stars. The wizard's grip tightened upon his staff, and for a moment the crystal set within its head blazed with answering fire. In that instant, visions flashed through his mind. Images of a prince standing in a garden where the trees themselves had spoken, of drums beating in the darkness of Mordor, and of a ring of gold lying hidden beneath the waters of a dark pool, waiting for the hand that would claim it. Faramir, Gandalf breathed, and the name carried with it the weight of prophecy. The hour draws near when all the threads of fate shall converge, and the choices of a single man may determine the destiny of all. Without further delay, he urged Shadowfax forward, and the great horse sprang into motion, as if the very ground beneath his hooves had taken fire. Across the rolling countryside they flew, through dell and over hill, following paths that seemed to open before them as if the land itself were eager to speed their passage. The wind sang about them, and in its voice Gandalf heard echoes of other journeys, other rides to the aid of those who stood upon the borders of hope and despair. As they rode, the wizard's thoughts turned to the tapestry of events that was even now being woven across the breadth of Middle-earth. In the north, he knew, the Shire lay peaceful still, though shadows gathered at its borders. In the east, the kingdoms of men girded themselves for war, while in the hidden halls of the dwarves, ancient grievances were set aside in the face of a common threat. And everywhere, the agents of the enemy moved like spiders across their web, seeking to divide and conquer those who might otherwise stand united against the coming darkness. But it was to Gondor that his path led now, to the realm that stood as the last great bastion of the West. There, in the halls of the stewards and upon the walls of Osgiliath, the first great test would come. And there, if the sign spoke true, a prince would face a choice that would echo through all the ages of the world. The sun was sinking toward the western mountains, when at last the towers of Osgiliath came into view, their broken stones catching the last light of day like old gold. Shadowfax slowed his pace as they approached the outer defenses, and Gandalf saw the guards upon the walls raise their hands in greeting. They knew him well, these men of Gondor, and they had learned to read in his coming the promise of both hope and peril. As they passed through the gates of the western city, Gandalf's eyes swept the familiar streets and buildings, noting the preparations for war that were already underway. Smiths worked at their forges through the night, and the sound of hammering rang like music through the evening air. Archers practiced their craft in the courtyards, and companies of soldiers drilled with spear and sword. All was as it should be, yet beneath the surface activity, the wizard sensed an undercurrent of unease, a feeling that time was running short, and that the enemy's plans were farther advanced than any had dared to imagine. At the door of the Great Hall, Gandalf dismounted and gave Shadowfax into the care of the grooms, though he knew the horse would come at his call whenever need arose. Then, gathering his grey robes about him, he climbed the steps to the chamber where Faramir held council with his captains, bearing with him tidings that would change the course of all their plans. For in the depths of his sight, Gandalf had seen the shape of things to come, and he knew that the time of testing was at hand. The council chamber of Osgiliath was lit by the pale glow of evening stars when Gandalf entered, his staff tapping softly upon the ancient stones. Around a great table of carved oak sat the captains of Gondor, their faces drawn with the weight of responsibility, and maps spread before them marked with the positions of companies and the reported movements of the enemy. At the head of the table sat Faramir, and in his grey eyes the wizard read the wisdom of one who had looked upon mysteries that few mortals were granted to see. "Mithrandir," the prince said, rising to greet his guest with the respect due to one whose counsel had long proven true. "Your coming brings both hope and fear to our hearts, for it is not your way to ride so swiftly, save when great need presses upon the world." "Indeed, the need is great," Gandalf replied, laying aside his hat and staff as he took the seat offered to him. "Greater perhaps than even I have fully grasped. But tell me first of your own tidings, Prince of Ithilien, for I sense that you too have looked upon things that trouble the spirit." So Faramir spoke of his encounter in the garden, of the Entwife's words and the visions she had shown him. The wizard listened in silence, his piercing gaze never leaving the young man's face, and when the tale was done, he nodded slowly. "The Ents stir to war," he murmured. "It has been long indeed since they marched to battle. That they do so now speaks to the depth of the peril that faces all living things. He paused, his fingers drumming upon the table as he pondered. And you say she spoke of Isengard? That name should give us pause, for Saruman the White dwells there, and his purposes have grown dark of late. There is more, Faramir said quietly. My rangers report strange sights from the borders of the Emyn Muil, lights where no lights should be, and a darkness that seems to reach out from the very stones themselves. And from the fishermen of the Anduin comes word of a tower that was not there in living memory, a fortress of black stone that rises from the marshes like a spear thrust up from the depths of the earth. At these words, Gandalf grew very still, and the light in his eyes became hard as steel. Show me, he commanded, and Faramir spread before him a map of the eastern lands, pointing to a place where the great river bent toward the south. Here, the prince said, where the old road from the Morannon crossed the marshes before Sauron's first defeat. The fishermen say it rises in the hours of darkness and fades with the dawn, as if it exists between the worlds of shadow and light. The wizard studied the map for a long moment, and when he looked up, his face was grave indeed. Dol Guldur, he whispered, and the very name seemed to cast a chill over the chamber. The hill of sorcery stirs once more. I had hoped, I had believed, that its power was broken when the White Council drove out the necromancer, but it seems that hope was misplaced. What is this place? Asked Mablung, speaking for the first time since the wizard's arrival. I have heard the name in old songs, but the singers tell different tales, and none of them pleasant. Gandalf was silent for a moment, his gaze turning toward the east as if he could see through stone and distance to the place they spoke of. When he answered, his voice carried the weight of long years and bitter memory. In the days when the world was younger, it was called Amon Lanc, the Naked Hill, and it was counted fair among the realms of the Eldar. But shadow came to it in the third age of the world, when a sorcerer of great power took up his dwelling there. The necromancer he was called by those who dared name him at all, and under his hand the hill became a place of dread and corruption. But you said the White Council drove him out. Faramir interrupted. Was that not the end of it? So we believed, the wizard replied heavily. And indeed, the necromancer fled before our assault, and we thought his power broken. But evil of that magnitude does not die easily, and it seems that some remnant of his malice has returned to its ancient seat. Whether it be the necromancer himself, returned from whatever dark exile he fled to, or some other power drawn to the tainted stones, I cannot say. But this I know, no good can come of Dol Guldur's rising. As if summoned by their words, a shadow seemed to pass over the chamber, though no cloud crossed the star-filled sky. The candles flickered, and for a moment the very air grew thick with an oppressive weight that pressed upon the hearts of all present. In that instant, each man felt as if unseen eyes were turned upon him, measuring his strength and finding it wanting. Then the moment passed, and the shadows retreated to their proper places. But the memory of that malevolent presence lingered, and none in the chamber doubted that their words had somehow been heard by ears that should not have been listening. We must send scouts, Faramir said at last, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at his heart. If this fortress is indeed rising again, we must know the extent of its power and the nature of its defenses. No, Gandalf said sharply. No mortal man should approach that place while its master's attention is turned toward it. The very air around Dol Guldur is poison to living things, and those who venture too near risk more than death. They risk the corruption of their very souls. He rose from his chair and began to pace the chamber, his staff clicking upon the stone floor. But you speak truly when you say we must know more. There are other ways to gather intelligence, ways that do not require sending brave men to their doom. The wizard paused by the great window that looked out over the eastern reaches of the city, and his gaze pierced the darkness that lay beyond the river. In the distance, barely visible against the star-lit sky, a faint glow could be seen, red as fire, cold as winter, pulsing with a rhythm like that of a vast and malevolent heart. "It calls to its scattered servants," Gandalf murmured, so quietly that only Faramir, who had approached to stand beside him, could hear. "Orcs and wolves, trolls and worse things that have no names in the tongues of men. They will come to it as iron filings to a lodestone, drawn by the promise of dark glory and the hope of sharing in their master's victory." "Then we are caught between two fires," Faramir observed. "Mordor gathers its strength in the east, while this new threat rises in the north. How can we hope to stand against both?" The wizard turned to meet the young man's eyes, and in his gaze Faramir saw depths of wisdom and sorrow that spoke of ages beyond mortal reckoning. "We stand because we must," Gandalf said simply. "We stand because the alternative is unthinkable. And we stand because, in the darkest hour, light has a way of appearing in the most unexpected places." As if in answer to his words, a sound drifted across the night air, distant but unmistakable. It was the song of the Ents, deep and resonant as the roots of mountains, calling to their scattered kindred across the breadth of Middle-earth. And in that sound, those who listened with understanding heard the promise that the ancient guardians of the forest had awakened at last, and that the war for the fate of all living things had truly begun. When the grey hour before dawn came, Gandalf stood alone upon the eastern bridge of Osgiliath, cloaked in shadow and silence. Behind him lay the sleeping city, its defenders still wrapped in whatever dreams the darkness might grant them. Before him stretched the wild lands of Ithilien, shrouded in mist that rose from the river like the breath of sleeping giants. And beyond that, hidden in the northern reaches where the marshes began, lay the object of his quest, Dol Guldur, the hill of sorcery, whose malevolent glow had haunted his thoughts through the sleepless hours of the night. He had left word with Faramir that he would return before the sun reached its zenith, but in his heart the wizard knew that no promise could be certain when one ventured into the realm of shadow. The very air seemed to thicken as he stepped from the bridge onto the eastern bank, and with each pace forward, the weight of accumulated malice pressed more heavily upon his spirit. Shadowfax waited at the boundary stones that marked the old border of Gondor's eastern holdings, his silver coat dim in the grey light, and his great eyes filled with an unease that spoke more clearly than words. Even this lord among horses, who had carried his rider through perils uncounted, would venture no farther into the tainted lands that lay ahead. "Wait for me here, my friend," Gandalf murmured, laying a hand upon the horse's neck. "If I do not return by the setting of the sun, carry word to Faramir, and bid him prepare for the worst." Shadowfax whinnied softly, a sound that carried both understanding and sorrow, then turned his face toward the west, as if seeking comfort in the distant sight of the mountains. Gandalf shouldered his pack and set forth alone, his staff glowing with a pale light that seemed to push back the gathering darkness by the span of a few yards only. The path he followed was ancient beyond reckoning, worn by the feet of kings and soldiers, merchants and pilgrims, in the days when the world was fairer and the shadow had not yet fallen upon so much of the earth. Now it was overgrown with thorns and twisted trees, and the very stones seemed to whisper warnings to those who would dare trespass upon the domain of the necromancer. As the miles passed beneath his feet, Gandalf felt the familiar signs of approaching evil. The way the air grew thick and hard to breathe, the manner in which sounds seemed muffled, as if heard through deep water, and the creeping sensation that unseen watchers tracked his every movement from the depths of the surrounding forest. Birds fell silent at his approach, and even the insects ceased their humming, until the only sound was the soft tread of his boots upon the leaf-strewn path. It was near the hour of noon, though the sun was hidden behind clouds black as ink when the wizard first caught sight of his destination. Through a gap in the trees ahead, a darkness rose that was deeper than the natural shadow, a hill crowned with twisted spires that clawed at the sky like the fingers of some buried giant. Dol Guldur stood revealed at last, and the sight of it struck cold fear into even Gandalf's ancient heart. The fortress was not built by mortal hands. That much was clear from the first glance. Its walls curved and flowed like living things, black as the void between the stars and seeming to absorb, rather than reflect, what little light reached them. Windows like hollow eyes stared out from its towers, and from somewhere within came a sound like breathing, vast, slow, and utterly malevolent. As Gandalf drew nearer, the very ground beneath his feet began to change. The healthy earth gave way to soil that was grey as ash and barren of all life. No grass grew here, no flowers bloomed, and the trees that stood sentinel around the hill's base were leafless and dead, their branches reaching skyward like the arms of supplicants frozen in their final agony. The silence was absolute, not the peaceful quiet of a forest glade, but the oppressive hush of a tomb sealed for centuries. It pressed against the wizard's ears like cotton, muffling even the sound of his own breathing, until he began to wonder if he still drew air at all. His staff's light seemed to grow dimmer with each step, as if the darkness itself were feeding upon it, drawing its power into the hungry void that surrounded the hill. At the foot of Dol Guldur, where once had stood gates of silver and gold, now yawned a chasm that seemed to descend into the very heart of the earth. No light penetrated its depths, and from within came whispers in languages that predated the awakening of men, voices that spoke of despair and ruin, of the futility of hope, and the inevitability of defeat. Gandalf paused at the threshold, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to flee this place of abomination, while flight was still possible. But duty held him fast, and the knowledge that the fate of Middle-earth might hang upon what he discovered within those cursed walls. Taking a deep breath of the fetid air, he spoke a word of power, and his staff blazed forth with light like a falling star. The darkness recoiled from that radiance, and for a moment the wizard saw the true nature of what lay before him. The chasm was no natural formation, but a wound in the world itself, a breach between the realms of light and shadow through which the malice of the void could seep like poison into the hearts of living things. And at its bottom, coiled like a serpent of living night, lay something that had no name in any tongue spoken beneath the sun. As that nameless horror stirred at the touch of his light, Gandalf felt its attention turn towards him like the gaze of 1,000 lidless eyes. In that moment, he understood with terrible clarity that the necromancer had indeed returned to his ancient seat, not in the flesh perhaps, but in spirit and will, and with power enough to corrupt the very foundations of the world. The thing in the depths began to rise, uncoiling itself with movements that defied both reason and sight. Tendrils of absolute darkness reached upward toward the wizard, seeking to drag him down into the lightless depths where sanity itself would be devoured. And from the towers above came a sound like laughter, cruel and mocking, and utterly without warmth. But Gandalf Greyhame was not without power of his own, and in the moment of greatest peril, he called upon the light that had been given to him in the halls of his master. His staff became as a blade of white fire, cutting through the reaching shadows and holding back the tide of malice that sought to overwhelm him. Step by step, he retreated from the chasm's edge, his light carving a path through the darkness, while behind him, the thing that dwelt in the depths howled its frustration to the uncaring sky. Not until he had passed beyond the boundary of the hill's influence did the wizard allow himself to stumble and fall to his knees, gasping air that seemed suddenly sweet after the poisonous atmosphere of Dol Guldur. his staff dimmed to its normal glow, and in the returning silence, he heard once more the distant sounds of life. A bird calling from a far tree, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth. But even as relief flooded through him, Gandalf knew that his fears had been confirmed. The necromancer had indeed returned to his ancient stronghold, and with him had come a darkness that threatened to swallow all the light in the world. The time of testing was at hand, and only the valor of men and the wisdom of the wise could hope to stand against the storm that was even now gathering in the north. The sun had passed its zenith and begun its descent toward the western mountains when Gandalf returned to Osgiliath, his face drawn with weariness and his eyes haunted by the visions he had witnessed in the depths of Dol Guldur. Yet it was not to the council chamber that he first directed his steps, but to the deepest cellars beneath the citadel, where the ancient dungeons of the old king still echoed with the weight of centuries. Word had reached him through ways known only to the wise that a prisoner had been taken in the night, one whose capture might shed light upon the enemy's designs. The rangers of Ithilien had found him wandering in the marshes east of the Anduin, clad in the remnants of rich robes and bearing upon his brow a circlet of tarnished gold. Yet it was not his raiment that marked him as worthy of special attention, but rather the terror that filled his eyes and the words he spoke in his delirium. Words that spoke of things no mortal man should know. Faramir waited at the entrance to the dungeons, his face grave with concern. "He has spoken little since we brought him here," the prince said as they descended the worn stone steps. "But what words have come from his lips fill our guards with unease. They say he speaks of the dead walking, and of a voice that calls from the darkness of the tomb." The dungeons of Osgiliath were not cruel places, for the kings of old had been just in their dealings, even with those who stood against them. The cells were clean and dry, lit by torches that burned with a steady flame, and furnished with simple comforts for those who dwelt within. Yet there was about them an air of great antiquity, and the very stones seemed to remember the weight of sorrows that had been borne within these walls. In the deepest cell of all sat their prisoner, and Gandalf paused upon the threshold as he beheld the man's appearance. Tall he had been in the days of his strength, with the noble bearing of one born to rule. His hair was dark shot through with silver, and his hands bore the calluses of one accustomed to sword and bow. Yet it was his eyes that spoke most clearly of his condition. They were the eyes of one who has gazed upon horrors beyond description and found his very soul marked by the experience. "I know you," Gandalf said softly, stepping into the cell with the measured pace of one who wishes to inspire trust rather than fear. "You are Thrain, son of Thror, king under the mountain. Long have your people mourned you as lost, and your son Thorin bears the weight of kingship in your stead." At the mention of his name, the dwarf lord raised his head, and for a moment clarity flickered in his tormented gaze. "Gandalf," he whispered, and his voice was like the sound of wind through empty halls. "Gandalf the Grey, who walked the roads of my youth. How comes it that I see you here, in this place of stone and shadow? Have you too been taken by the servants of the Dark Lord?" "I am free, Lord of the Longbeards," the wizard replied, settling himself upon a simple stool that had been placed within the cell. "It is you who have been captive, these many years past. Tell me, what do you remember of your imprisonment? What did you see in the halls of your captors?" Thrain's face contorted with pain, and his hands clenched into fists as memories flooded back to him. "The darkness," he moaned. "The endless darkness of Dol Guldur, where the light of sun and moon never penetrates. I was taken while searching for the lost treasure of my fathers, seeking the gold that was stolen from the halls of Erebor. But instead of gold, I found only shadow and torment." "How long?" Gandalf asked gently. "How long were you held in that cursed place?" "Years," Thrain replied, rocking back and forth in his anguish. Years beyond counting, though time has no meaning in the domain of the necromancer, I was brought before him, before the shadow that sits upon the throne of lies, and he spoke to me of things that should not be spoken. He showed me visions of the future, of fire and ruin, of the gold of Erebor running like water through the streets of Dale. Faramir exchanged a glance with Gandalf, for both men understood the import of these words. The dragon Smaug still lay coiled within the lonely mountain, and the prophecies spoke of a time when he would wake to wreak havoc upon the lands of men. What else did he show you? The wizard pressed. What other visions did the necromancer reveal? Thrain's voice dropped to a whisper, and his eyes grew wide with terror. A ring, he breathed. A ring of gold that shines with its own fell light. He spoke of it constantly, in the long hours when sleep would not come. My precious, he would say, over and over, until the words echoed in the very stones of his fortress. He searches for it still, this ring that was lost, and when he finds it, the dwarf lord's words trailed off into incoherent muttering. But Gandalf leaned forward, his face pale with sudden understanding. What of this ring? He demanded. What did he tell you of its powers? The one, Thrain whispered, and the very air in the cell seemed to grow cold at the words. The ruling ring that binds all others to its will. He forged it in the fires of Mount Doom, in the days when the world was young, and into it he poured his malice and his will. Lost it was, in the waters of Anduin, when the kings of old threw down his power, but it endures still, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for the hand that will claim it. Gandalf rose abruptly from his seat, his staff clenched tightly in his hand. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the picture they revealed filled him with a dread deeper than any he had known since the breaking of Thangorodrim. For if the necromancer was indeed Sauron returned, and if the One Ring still lay hidden somewhere in Middle-earth, then the peril facing the Free Peoples was far greater than any had imagined. He made me tell him, Thrain continued, oblivious to the wizard's distress. Made me speak of the dwarves of Erebor, of their strength and their weaknesses. He knows of the secret door, Gandalf. He knows of the passage that leads to the heart of the mountain, and he has plans for the dragon that sleeps within. What plans? Faramir asked, though his voice was barely above a whisper. Thrain laughed then, a sound devoid of all mirth or sanity. He will wake the worm, he said. When the time is right, he will send whispers through the darkness, promises of gold and glory, until Smaug stirs from his centuries of slumber. And when the dragon rises, he will lay waste to all the lands between the misty mountains and the Sea of Rhûn. The implications of this revelation struck both Gandalf and Faramir like physical blows. If Smaug could be roused to destroy the northern lands, then the forces that might otherwise come to Gondor's aid would be scattered or destroyed. The kingdom would stand alone against the full might of Mordor, with no hope of succor from the realms of Rohan or Dale. There is more, Thrain continued, his voice growing fainter with each word. In the deepest dungeon of Dol Guldur, beneath the roots of the hill itself, he keeps a trophy, a ring taken from my hand when first I was captured. Not the One Ring, but one of the 7 that were given to the dwarf lords in the days of old. He uses it to torment me, showing me visions of my people's suffering, of Thorin's struggles to reclaim our homeland. Gandalf's eyes blazed with sudden fire. You still had one of the 7, after all these years. My father's ring, Thrain replied proudly, though tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. The ring of Thror, king under the mountain. It was the last of the 7 not taken by the dragons or consumed by fire. And now it rests in the necromancer's hoard, another tool in his arsenal of corruption. The wizard stood in silence for a long moment, his mind racing as he considered all he had learned. The return of the necromancer to Dol Guldur, the search for the One Ring, the plan to wake Smaug, All of it pointed to a design of vast scope and terrible purpose. The enemy was not content merely to reclaim his ancient stronghold in Mordor. He sought to dominate all of Middle-earth, and he was willing to use every weapon at his disposal to achieve that end. "Rest now, Lord of the Longbeards," Gandalf said at last, his voice gentle despite the turmoil in his heart. "You have endured much, and told us more than you know. The knowledge you have shared may yet prove the salvation of us all." As they left the dungeons and climbed once more toward the light, Faramir spoke the words that were in both their hearts. "The hour is later than we feared, is it not? The enemy moves on many fronts, and we are caught unprepared." "Perhaps," Gandalf replied thoughtfully, "but despair is the enemy's greatest weapon, and we must not yield to it while hope remains. Thrain's escape from Dol Guldur was no accident, of that I am certain. Some power greater than our own willed that he should come to us at this hour, bearing the knowledge we needed to prepare for what is to come." Yet even as he spoke these words of comfort, the wizard's heart was heavy with foreboding. For he had recognized in Thrain's ravings the signs of a plan so vast and ambitious that its success would mean the end of all free will in Middle-earth. The time for half measures and cautious counsel was over. If the darkness was to be defeated, it would require sacrifices that would echo through all the ages of the world. That night, as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient courses, and the city of Osgiliath lay wrapped in uneasy slumber, a darkness deeper than the absence of light crept through the eastern quarters like a living thing. It moved without sound, without form, yet its presence was felt by every creature that drew breath, from the horses in their stables, who whinnied in terror, to the very stones of the walls that seemed to whisper in languages long forgotten. Faramir woke from dreams of burning cities and falling towers to find his chamber filled with a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. Beside his bed, a single candle flickered with a flame that gave no warmth, its light pale and sickly as the glow of marsh fire. Yet it was not the cold that had awakened him, nor the one light of the candle, but rather the certain knowledge that he was no longer alone. In the deepest corner of the chamber, where shadow pooled like dark water, something stirred, not a shape that the eye could fix upon, nor a presence that the mind could fully grasp, but rather an absence, a place where the very fabric of the world seemed worn thin, allowing something from beyond to seep through like poison, through a wound. "Prince of Gondor," came a voice that was not a voice, speaking words that seemed to form within Faramir's own mind, rather than reaching his ears through the air. "Son of the steward who sits in the seat of kings, yet knows not the weight of the crown he bears." Faramir reached for his sword, though his hand trembled as it closed upon the hilt. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at his heart. "By what right do you enter the halls of the stewards?" Laughter answered him, cold and mocking, like the sound of ice breaking in the depths of winter. "Right?" the voice replied. "I am beyond such mortal concepts as right and law. I am the shadow that falls across the sun, the darkness that dwells in the hearts of men. I am the necromancer of Dol Guldur, and my right is the right of power." The temperature in the chamber dropped still further, and Faramir's breath began to mist in the frigid air. Upon the walls, frost formed in intricate patterns that hurt the eye to look upon, while beneath his feet the very stones groaned as if under some immense weight. "You speak with the voice of madness," Faramir said, though he made no move to draw his blade. Some instinct warned him that steel would avail nothing against the presence that confronted him. "The necromancer was driven from his fortress years ago by the White Council. He has no power here." "Has he not?" the shadow asked, and now there was amusement in its tone, the amusement of a cat that toys with a mouse before the kill. "Then how comes it that I speak with you now, young prince? How comes it that your dreams are filled with visions of fire and death? and that your waking hours are haunted by the certainty of approaching doom." As the shadow spoke, images flickered through Faramir's mind. Visions of Osgiliath in flames, of orcs pouring across the broken bridges like a black tide, of his own men falling beneath the weight of overwhelming numbers. He saw the citadel of Gondor dark and empty, its white stones stained with blood, and the banner of the stewards trampled in the mud. "Lies," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction, for in his heart he had seen these same visions in the long watches of the night, and had felt the weight of prophecy in their terrible clarity. "Truth," the necromancer replied, "truth such as few mortals are granted to see. Your realm stands upon the edge of a knife, Prince of Gondor, and the smallest push will send it tumbling into the abyss. Your father knows this, though he speaks of it to none. It is why he sits alone in his tower, gazing into the fires that show him visions of what is to come." Faramir's blood chilled at these words, for they spoke to fears he had harbored but never voiced. In recent months, Denethor had grown ever more withdrawn, spending long hours in the Tower of Ecthelion with only the Palantir for company. When he emerged, his eyes held a haunted look, and his words spoke of despair rather than hope. "What do you want?" the prince asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Want?" The shadow seemed to consider the question, and when it spoke again, its voice held a note of ancient weariness. "I want what I have always wanted, the dominion of all that lives beneath the sky. I want the light extinguished and the darkness made eternal. I want the songs of joy to be replaced by the cries of the tormented, and the laughter of children to give way to the silence of the grave." The presence pressed closer, and Faramir felt its malice like a physical weight upon his soul. In that moment, he understood with terrible clarity that he stood not before some lesser evil, but before the very source of the darkness that had plagued Middle-earth for countless ages. But desires and wants are the province of lesser beings. The necromancer continued, "I deal in certainties, in the inevitable working of fate, and it is certain that your realm will fall, as all realms fall in time. The only question is whether it will fall quickly, with honor intact, or slowly, degraded by compromise and surrender." "Gondor will never surrender," Faramir declared, though his voice shook with the effort of speech. "Will it not?" the shadow asked. "Even now, your father's mind turns toward thoughts of accommodation. He sees the strength of my armies, the futility of resistance, and he begins to wonder if some agreement might be reached, some treaty that would preserve a remnant of his people's independence." Horror flooded through Faramir as he recognized the truth in these words. He had seen the signs himself. The way Denethor spoke of the coming war as if it were already lost. The manner in which he weighed every decision against the cost in lives and treasure. "He will not yield," the prince said, but even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at his certainty. "Perhaps not," the necromancer admitted. "Your father has a strong will, and the blood of Numenor runs true in his veins. But wills can be broken, Prince of Gondor, and even the strongest steel will shatter if sufficient pressure is applied. Already I have begun to work upon his mind, showing him visions of defeat and desolation. How long do you think his resolve will last when he sees his beloved city burning and his people crying out for mercy?" The shadow began to withdraw then, retreating toward the corner from whence it had come. But its voice lingered, growing fainter but no less malevolent. "Remember this night, son of Denethor. Remember that I offered you knowledge of what is to come, and consider well whether ignorance is truly preferable to truth. For the darkness approaches whether you acknowledge it or not, and when it arrives, those who have prepared may yet find a place in the new order that will arise from the ashes of the old. "We will resist you," Faramir called after the retreating presence. "To our last breath, we will resist." "Resist by all means," came the fading reply. "Your defiance will make the final victory all the sweeter. But know this, the ring that I seek draws closer to my grasp with each passing day, and when I reclaim what was taken from me, not all the courage of men nor the wisdom of the Eldar will avail to stand against my might." The presence vanished like smoke upon the wind, leaving behind only the bitter cold and the memory of malice beyond measure. Faramir sank into his chair, his strength drained by the encounter, and stared at the place where the shadow had been. The candle beside his bed guttered and went out, plunging the chamber into darkness, but he made no move to relight it. For what need had he of physical light when the darkness in his heart was deeper than any that night could bring? Outside his window, the stars continued their eternal dance, cold and distant as they had been since the world was young. But to Faramir, their light seemed dimmed, as if the very fabric of creation had been somehow tainted by the presence that had walked among them. And in the depths of his soul, he felt the first stirrings of a despair that he feared might prove stronger than all his courage and resolve. Yet even in that dark hour, a spark of defiance remained, for he was a prince of Gondor, heir to the blood of the kings of old, and he would not yield to fear while strength remained in his body and breath in his lungs. The enemy might be strong beyond measure, his plans vast and his malice deep, but he was not unopposed. Somewhere in the world, other lights burned against the darkness, and while they endured, hope itself could not be entirely extinguished. But as dawn approached and the stars began to fade, Faramir wondered how long those lights would last, and whether they would prove sufficient to hold back the tide of shadow that even now was gathering strength for the final assault upon all that was fair and free in Middle-earth. The first light of dawn had not yet touched the eastern sky when Gandalf felt the disturbance that rippled through the very foundations of Osgiliath, like a stone cast into still water. He had been walking the battlements in the grey hour before sunrise, his mind heavy with the revelations of Thrain and the growing certainty that time was running short. But this new presence, cold and malevolent and altogether too familiar, drove all other thoughts from his mind. In 3 swift strides, the wizard reached the tower that housed Faramir's chambers, his staff blazing with sudden fire as he climbed the winding stairs. The very stones beneath his feet seemed to recoil from some contamination, and the air itself felt thick with an oppressive weight that spoke of ancient evil stirring. At the door to the prince's chamber, Gandalf paused, his keen senses detecting the lingering traces of a power that should not have been able to manifest so far from its source. He found Faramir seated in darkness, his face pale as carved marble, and his eyes staring sightlessly into the shadows. The chamber was cold as a tomb, and frost covered the walls in patterns that hurt to look upon directly. Yet it was not the physical cold that concerned the wizard, but rather the deeper chill that had settled upon the young man's spirit, the mark of one who has gazed too long into the abyss and felt it gazing back. "He was here," Faramir said without turning, his voice flat and lifeless as winter wind. "The necromancer. He spoke to me of surrender and accommodation, of the futility of resistance against his might." Gandalf's grip tightened upon his staff, and the crystals set within its head pulsed with angry light. "And what did you tell him, Prince of Gondor?" "That we would resist to our last breath," Faramir replied, though his voice held no conviction. "But he knew things about my father, about the visions in the Palantir. He spoke as one who has already won, and waits only for his enemies to acknowledge their defeat." The wizard moved to the window and gazed out into the night, his eyes piercing the darkness with a clarity born of centuries of vigilance. There, in the distance where Dol Guldur reared its twisted spires against the star-filled sky, he could see the red glow that marked the necromancer's stronghold. But now that glow pulsed with a rhythm like a vast heartbeat, and from it emanated waves of malice that pressed against his mind like physical blows. "He seeks to break your will before the battle is even joined," Gandalf said, his voice hard as iron. "It is an old tactic of the enemy, to defeat his foes in spirit before ever crossing blades with them in the field. But you are stronger than you know, son of Denethor, and your heart holds reserves of courage that even you have not yet discovered." As he spoke, the wizard raised his staff high, and the light that blazed from its tip drove back the shadows that clung to the chamber's corners. The frost upon the walls began to melt, running down the stone in rivulets of clear water, and the oppressive weight that had pressed upon the room lifted like morning mist before the sun. But even as the immediate darkness retreated, Gandalf felt the necromancer's attention turn toward them across the miles that separated Osgiliath from Dol Guldur. It was like standing beneath the gaze of a great eye, cold and pitiless and filled with malevolent intelligence. The very air began to thicken once more, and shadows started to gather at the edges of the chamber despite the blazing light of the staff. "So," came a voice that seemed to speak from the stones themselves, "the grey fool still meddles in affairs beyond his understanding. How long has it been, Gandalf Greyhame, since last we spoke face to face?" The wizard's eyes blazed with sudden fury, and when he answered, his voice carried the authority of one who had walked in the halls of the Valar and been granted power over the forces of light and darkness. "Long enough for you to forget, it seems, Sauron the Deceiver, that there are those in this world who will not bow to your malice." The shadows in the chamber recoiled as if struck by lightning, and for a moment the temperature rose as Gandalf's power clashed with the malevolent presence that sought to manifest within the room. Yet the necromancer's voice only grew stronger, more mocking, as if he drew strength from the very opposition itself. "Sauron," the voice laughed, and the sound was like the breaking of bells. "That name is but one among many that I have worn in the long ages of my existence. I am the shadow behind every throne, the whisper in every tyrant's ear, the fear that drives men to desperation and despair. I am the inevitable darkness that comes at the end of all things, and no power in Middle-earth can stand against my might." Gandalf stepped forward, his staff held before him like a sword of white fire. Where its light touched the walls, ancient symbols blazed forth, runes of protection and binding that had been carved by the kings of old when first they raised these halls. The very stones of Osgiliath seemed to remember their purpose, and they sang with a voice that had been silent for centuries. "You are a liar and a deceiver," the wizard declared, his voice ringing with the authority of ages. "You speak of inevitability, yet you cower in your fortress of shadows, sending whispers and dreams to do your work while you yourself dare not venture forth. If your victory is so certain, why do you not come in your own form and claim what you believe to be yours by right?" The malevolent presence roared with fury at these words, and the very foundations of the tower shook beneath the weight of its rage. Frost formed again upon the walls, but now it was met by answering fire that blazed from every stone and timber of the ancient citadel. The battle was joined not merely between two powers, but between the very principles they represented: hope against despair, light against darkness, the will to endure against the counsel of surrender. "You think your little light can stand against the darkness that I bring?" the necromancer snarled. "I have seen the end of all things, wizard. I have looked into the heart of the void and found it fair. Your precious Gondor will burn as all kingdoms burn, and your defiance will be remembered only as the folly of those too proud to accept the inevitable." But Gandalf stood unmoved by these threats, his staff blazing ever brighter as he drew upon the power that had been granted to him by his master. "Then let it burn," he said quietly, and his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Let it burn bright and clean. a beacon to all who come after that there were those in this world who chose to stand against the darkness, whatever the cost. The wizard raised his staff high above his head, and the light that poured forth from it was no longer merely the pale radiance of spellcraft, but something deeper and more fundamental. The light of Erendil's star, the flame of the two trees that had illuminated Valinor in the days before the sun and moon. It blazed through the chamber and beyond, piercing the walls as if they were made of glass, reaching out across the dark miles to touch the very foundations of Dol Guldur itself. For one brief shining moment, the light of the Blessed Realm shone forth in the darkness of Middle-earth, and all who beheld it, from the guards upon the walls to the creatures that crept in the deepest dungeons, knew that they had witnessed something beyond the power of mortal understanding. The shadows fled before that radiance like wolves before the dawn, and even the malevolent presence of the necromancer wavered and grew dim. "This is not ended between us, wizard," came the voice, now faint and distant as an echo in a deep cave. "You have won this single battle, but the war itself is far from over. When next we meet, it will be upon a field of my choosing, and your little light will avail you nothing against the darkness I shall bring." The presence vanished like smoke upon the wind, leaving behind only the clean scent of mountain air and the gentle warmth of true sunlight. The frost melted from the walls, and the oppressive weight that had pressed upon the chamber lifted completely. In its place came a sense of peace and renewal that spoke of victories yet to be won and hopes yet to be fulfilled. Faramir had risen from his chair during the confrontation, and now he stood with wonder written upon his face. The despair that had gripped his heart was gone, replaced by something he had not felt since childhood. The absolute certainty that, whatever trials lay ahead, he would not face them alone. "The light still shines," Gandalf said softly, lowering his staff as its radiance dimmed to its normal glow. "In all the darkness that surrounds us, in all the fear and uncertainty that clouds our path, the light still shines. Remember that, Prince of Gondor, in the days that are to come, for it is in that light that our true strength lies, and no power of the enemy can extinguish it, while courage remains in the hearts of those who bear it." As the first rays of the true dawn began to creep across the eastern sky, both wizard and prince stood in silence, each drawing strength from the other's presence. The battle lines had been drawn, and the true war was about to begin. But for this one moment, in this one chamber high above the ancient city of kings, the light had triumphed over the darkness, and hope had driven back despair. It was enough. For now, it was enough. In the golden halls of Rivendell, where the wisdom of ages was preserved in scrolls and songs, the White Council gathered as they had not gathered for many years. The last homely house stood serene beneath the autumn stars, its walls echoing with the voices of those who had walked Middle-earth since its foundation and seen the rise and fall of kingdoms beyond counting. Yet there was no peace in the hearts of those who sat in council that night, for the news that Gandalf brought cast shadows even over the timeless beauty of Elrond's realm. At the head of the great table sat Elrond half-elven, his ageless face marked with the gravity of one who bore the weight of countless sorrows. To his right sat Galadriel, Lady of Lothlorien, her eyes holding depths that reflected the light of the two trees themselves. And across from her, his white robes gleaming like snow in moonlight, sat Saruman the White, chief of the Astari and leader of their order. Others were there as well, Círdan the shipwright from the Grey Havens, and Glorfindel of the House of the Golden Flower, along with the other lords of the Eldar who held the burden of watching over the affairs of Middle-earth. Gandalf stood before them, his grey cloak travel-stained and his staff dim with weariness. For 3 days he had ridden without rest from Osgiliath, driven by the urgency of the tidings he bore. The confrontation with the necromancer had left its mark upon him, and those with the sight could see the shadows that clung to his spirit like cobwebs in a forgotten corner. "I have seen Dol Guldur," the grey wizard began, his voice heavy with the weight of dark knowledge. "The fortress rises again in all its malevolent glory, and the power that dwells within it is no lesser servant of the enemy, but Sauron himself, returned from whatever exile he had fled to when we drove him from his stronghold." Murmurs of dismay ran around the table, but Saruman raised his hand for silence. "You speak with great certainty, Gandalf," he said, his voice smooth as silk yet cold as winter wind. "But certainty requires proof, and what you describe is merely the return of some sorcerer to a place where sorcery has long held sway. Why do you believe this to be the Dark Lord himself?" Gandalf's eyes flashed, with irritation, but he kept his voice level as he replied, "Because I have felt his presence, Saruman the White. I have heard his voice and felt the weight of his malice. There is no power in Middle-earth that could counterfeit such darkness. No sorcerer save Sauron himself, who could command the forces that even now gather beneath the banner of Dol Guldur." "Perhaps," Saruman replied, with a dismissive wave of his hand, "but consider the implications of what you suggest. If the Dark Lord has indeed returned, then surely he would have made his presence known in Mordor, not hidden himself in the ruins of an old fortress. Barad-dûr stands empty still, its gates sealed and its fires cold. Would Sauron truly content himself with so lesser a stronghold when the Black Tower awaits his return?" Lady Galadriel leaned forward, her voice like the sound of silver bells in the wind. "The ways of the enemy are not always what they seem, Saruman. Perhaps he seeks to lull us into complacency, to make us believe that the danger lies elsewhere while he gathers his strength in secret. Or perhaps," Saruman countered, his tone growing sharper, "Gandalf has allowed his fears to overcome his judgment. The Grey Pilgrim has ever been quick to see shadows where none exist, to cry alarm at every rumor and whisper that reaches his ears." The words stung, for they touched upon doubts that Gandalf himself had harbored in the darkest hours of the night. Had he truly faced Sauron in the depths of Dol Guldur, or had his fears given shape to some lesser evil? The enemy was cunning beyond measure, and it would not be beyond his power to create phantoms and illusions to confuse his foes. Yet, even as these doubts crept into his mind, Gandalf remembered the weight of the presence he had felt, the absolute certainty of malice that had pressed upon his spirit like a physical force. No illusion could have borne such power, no phantom could have spoken with such authority. "I know what I have seen," he said firmly, "and I know what must be done. The White Council was formed to watch for the return of the Shadow, and now that Shadow has returned in truth. We must act swiftly before Sauron can complete whatever plans he has set in motion." Elrond nodded slowly, his wise eyes reflecting the depths of his understanding. "Gandalf speaks truly," he said. "I too have felt the stirring of old evils, the awakening of powers that should have remained forever bound. In the darkness of my dreams, I have seen visions of fire and ruin, of the ancient enemy risen once more to trouble the peace of the world." "Dreams and visions," Saruman scoffed. "Are we to base our actions on phantoms of the night? The White Council has ever been cautious in its deliberations, weighing each decision against its consequences. Shall we now abandon wisdom for the sake of haste?" Círdan the shipwright spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of one who had seen the first rising of the sun and would see its final setting. "Caution has its place, Saruman the Wise, but so too does decisiveness. If there is even the possibility that Sauron has returned, can we afford to ignore the signs?" "And what would you have us do?" Saruman demanded, rising from his seat to pace the chamber. "March upon Dol Guldur with banners flying and trumpets sounding. Drive out whatever power dwells there with fire and sword. Such actions would serve only to reveal our own strength to the enemy, to show him what forces we could bring to bear against him. Better that than to allow him to gather his strength in secret, Gandalf replied hotly. Every day we delay gives him time to corrupt more servants to his cause, to weave new webs of malice and deceit. The longer we wait, the stronger he becomes. The argument continued through the hours of the night, with each member of the council contributing their voice to the debate. Some sided with Gandalf, urging immediate action against the growing threat. Others supported Saruman's counsel of caution, arguing that hasty decisions made in fear often led to greater disasters than the evils they sought to prevent. It was Galadriel who finally spoke the words that would shape their course. "There is wisdom in both councils," she said, her voice cutting through the heated debate like a blade of starlight. "Action and caution each have their place, but neither alone will serve us in this hour. We must be swift but not reckless, bold but not foolish." She rose from her seat and moved to the great window that looked out over the valley of Rivendell, where the stars shone down upon the ageless beauty of the elven realm. When she spoke again, her words carried the weight of prophecy. "The necromancer must be driven from Dol Guldur, this much is certain. But the assault must be carefully planned. The forces gathered in secret, the blow struck with precision rather than brute force. If we act too openly, we risk revealing our hand to other servants of the enemy who may be watching. If we act too slowly, we give the necromancer time to prepare defenses that might prove impossible to breach." Elrond nodded his agreement. A small force then, moving in secret. Not an army that would draw attention, but a strike force capable of penetrating the fortress and confronting whatever power dwells within. "And who would lead such a force?" Saruman asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. All eyes turned to Gandalf, and in their gaze he read both trust and expectation. The Grey Wizard sighed, feeling the weight of responsibility settle upon his shoulders like a cloak of lead. He had known this moment would come, had felt it approaching like a storm upon the horizon. Yet knowing and accepting were different things entirely. "I will go," he said simply. "It was I who first brought word of the necromancer's return, and it is fitting that I should be the one to face him. But I will need allies, others who can stand against the darkness without being corrupted by it. The sons of Elrond will ride with you," their father declared. "Elladan and Elrohir have fought against the servants of the enemy in many battles, and their swords have never known defeat. And I will send word to my kinsmen in Lothlorien," Galadriel added. "There are warriors among the Galadhrim who remember the wars of the elder days, who have faced the darkness and emerged victorious." One by one, the members of the council pledged their support, offering what aid they could for the perilous mission that lay ahead. Yet Gandalf noticed that Saruman remained silent, his face unreadable as he listened to the plans taking shape around him. "What of you, Saruman the White?" Gandalf asked at last. "Will you not join us in this endeavor? Your power would be of great value in the coming battle." Saruman's smile was cold and distant as winter stars. "My duties lie elsewhere, Gandalf the Grey. There are other matters that require my attention, other threats that must be watched. I trust you will be able to manage without my assistance." The words were polite enough, but Gandalf heard the undertone of dismissal, even mockery, that lay beneath them. For a moment, he wondered at the change that had come over his fellow wizard. When had Saruman become so cold, so calculating in his dealings with others? But there was no time to ponder such questions now, not with the weight of the mission pressing upon them all. As the council dispersed and the members went their separate ways, Gandalf remained behind in the golden halls of Rivendell, staring out at the stars and wondering what the future would bring. The assault on Dol Guldur would be dangerous beyond measure, and he could not guarantee its success. But to do nothing would be to accept defeat before the battle was even joined, and that was a course he could not countenance. Somewhere in the darkness, the enemy was stirring. Soon, very soon, the time for half measures and cautious counsel would be over. The final war for the fate of Middle-earth was about to begin, and all who loved freedom would be called upon to take their stand against the coming darkness. The autumn winds carried the scent of snow from the distant peaks of the misty mountains as Gandalf rode north from Rivendell, his path taking him along roads that had grown wild and treacherous in the years since the great kingdoms of the north had fallen into decline. Behind him lay the wisdom and counsel of the Eldar, but ahead stretched lands where the older, fiercer peoples still held to their ancient ways, lands where the memory of Dragonfire still burned bright in the hearts of those who had lost everything to Smaug's greed. The Grey Wizard's mind was heavy with the weight of plans within plans, for the assault on Dol Guldur, necessary though it was, represented only one thread in the vast tapestry of events that must be woven if the Shadow was to be defeated. The enemy's revelation of his designs upon the Lonely Mountain had opened Gandalf's eyes to possibilities he had not considered before, ways in which the scattered forces of good might be brought together, if only the proper catalyst could be found. It was in the valley of the Bruinen, where the waters sang their eternal songs of memory and loss, that the wizard first encountered the signs he had been seeking. A band of dwarves traveling south from the Iron Hills brought word of strange happenings in the north, of lights in the sky above Erebor, of rumblings deep within the mountain that spoke of the dragon's restlessness. More telling still were the tales they told of Thorin Oakenshield, son of the captive king, who had taken to wandering the halls of his exile with the look of one who hears voices calling from afar. "He speaks often of his grandfather's map," said Dwalin, a grizzled warrior whose axes had tasted orc blood in 100 battles. "The old parchment that shows the secret ways into the mountain, the paths that Thror used in the days before the dragon came. Some say he has grown obsessed with it, that he traces the lines with his finger and mutters of keys and doors that were lost in the ruin of Dale." Gandalf listened to these words with growing interest, for he remembered well the map that Thrain had carried, remembered too the key that had accompanied it, both given into his keeping in the dungeons of Dol Guldur before the Dwarf Lord's escape. The wizard's hand moved unconsciously to the pouch at his belt, where those precious artifacts lay hidden beneath layers of concealment and protection. "And what of the other kingdoms of the dwarves?" he asked. "Do they also feel the stirring of old grievances, the call to reclaim what was lost?" "Dain Ironfoot speaks much of the old days," replied another of the company, a younger dwarf whose beard was still more brown than grey. "He has strengthened the defences of the Iron Hills and speaks of marching west when the time is right, but he will not move without cause, without some sign that the attempt would be more than mere folly." The wizard nodded thoughtfully, his keen mind already working through the implications. The dwarves were proud and stubborn, slow to anger, but terrible in their wrath when finally roused. They would not act on hope alone, but if the proper opportunity could be created, if Smaug could be drawn from his lair or weakened in some way, then the ancient grievances might yet become the fuel for a great alliance. As the days passed and Gandalf continued his journey northward, he began to weave the first strands of a plan that would require all his wisdom and not a little luck to bring to fruition. The dragon must be dealt with. Of that there was no doubt. Smaug's continued presence in Erebor served only the enemy's purposes, keeping the northern lands weak and divided. But how to accomplish such a feat when all the armies of men and elves had proven insufficient to the task? The answer, when it came to him, was both simple and audacious. Not through force of arms would the dragon be defeated, but through cunning and courage, and through the agency of one whom none would suspect of harboring such ambitions. For in the depths of his memory, Gandalf recalled the words of an old rhyme, learned long ago in the halls of the Shire. "The great dragon sleeps on gold and stone, but the small may walk where the large may not. What is lost by the mighty and strong may be found by the weak and the small." It was in the wild lands east of the Misty Mountains that the wizard's path finally led him to the object of his search. There, in a camp hidden among the rocks and sheltered from the wind, he found Thorin Oakenshield himself, accompanied by a small band of his kinsmen. The exiled king sat before a fire that cast dancing shadows on the weathered stone, and in his hands he held the very map that Dwalin had spoken of, a parchment yellowed with age and marked with runes that told the secret ways into the heart of the mountain. Thorin looked up as Gandalf approached, and in his eyes the wizard saw the fire of one who has been driven too long from his rightful place. Dark was the dwarf lord's hair, streaked now with silver at the temples, and his face bore the lines that come from years of exile and loss. Yet his bearing was still proud, still regal, and in his voice was the authority of one born to command. "Gandalf Greyheim," Thorin said, rising to greet his unexpected visitor. "What brings the Grey Wanderer to our camp? Do you bring news from the wide world, or do you seek something from the children of Durin?" "Both, perhaps," the wizard replied, settling himself beside the fire with the easy grace of one accustomed to life in the wild. "I bring word from the south that may be of interest to you, and I seek counsel from one whose wisdom in matters of war and strategy is known throughout the north." For long hours they spoke, sharing tales of the growing darkness and the movements of the enemy's servants. Gandalf told of the assault being planned against Dol Guldur, of the need to strike at the necromancer before his power could grow too great to challenge. In return, Thorin spoke of his own concerns, of the dragon that slept upon the treasure of his fathers, of the desolation that lay upon Dale and the surrounding lands, of the longing that burned in every dwarf's heart to see the lonely mountain restored to its former glory. "Yet what can be done?" Thorin asked at last, his voice heavy with frustration. "Smaug is mighty beyond measure, his scales harder than steel, and his fire hotter than the forge flames of our ancestors. All who have challenged him have been destroyed. Men and elves and dwarves alike have fallen before his wrath." Gandalf was silent for a moment, staring into the flames as if seeking guidance in their dancing light. When he spoke, his voice was soft but filled with conviction. "What if I told you that there was a way? Not to challenge the dragon in open battle, for that would indeed be folly, but to approach him unaware, to find the secrets that he guards so jealously." The dwarf lord leaned forward, his eyes sharp with sudden interest. "What way? What path could lead past the vigilance of Smaug the Mighty?" From his pouch, Gandalf drew forth the key that Thrain had carried, a thing of ancient make, wrought in the shape of a dragon's claw, and inscribed with runes that few could read. At the sight of it, Thorin gasped and half rose from his seat, for he knew it for what it was. The key to the secret door that his grandfather had caused to be made in the days of the mountain's glory. "This came from your father," the wizard said quietly. "He gave it to me in the dungeons of Dol Guldur, along with the map you hold. He charged me to return both to their rightful owner when the time was right." Thorin took the key with reverent hands, his fingers tracing the ancient runes with the touch of one who handles a sacred relic. "The key of Erebor," he whispered. "I had thought it lost forever, consumed in the fires of the dragon's coming." "Nothing is ever truly lost," Gandalf replied. "It may be hidden or forgotten or cast aside, but if it has value, if it serves a purpose in the great design, then it will return when it is needed most." The implications of the key's return were not lost on the dwarf lord, but practical considerations quickly asserted themselves. Even with the key, the task would be perilous beyond measure. The secret door opens onto a narrow ledge high on the mountain's face, and from there the path leads down into the very heart of Smaug's lair. What force could hope to reach that place undetected, to steal past the dragon's watch and escape with their lives? "Not a force," Gandalf said with a slight smile. A single individual, one small and quiet, skilled in the arts of stealth, and possessed of courage greater than his size might suggest. Thorin frowned, not understanding. What individual could possess such skills? The greatest warriors of our people would be as children before the dragon's might. I speak not of warriors, the wizard replied. I speak of a burglar, one who makes his living by moving unseen and taking what is not freely given. There are those in Middle-earth who possess such skills, though they are not often found among the high and mighty of the world. The idea was so audacious, so contrary to all accepted wisdom about dealing with dragons, that Thorin could only stare in wonder. Yet, as the implications sank in, he began to see the brilliance of the plan. A burglar might indeed succeed where armies had failed, not through strength of arm, but through cunning and stealth. And where would we find such a one? He asked. What burglar would be mad enough to attempt such a feat? Gandalf's smile widened, and in his eyes danced a light that spoke of plans, within plans, of wheels set in motion that would turn for years to come. Leave that to me, Thorin Oakenshield. I know of one who might serve, one whose courage is greater than his size, and whose heart is braver than his own understanding. But first, we must gather your company. 12 companions to share in the quest and the glory that will come with its success. And so, in that hidden camp among the wild stones of the eastern lands, the first threads of the great adventure were spun. Before the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, plans were made and oaths were sworn that would echo through the ages of the world. The quest for Erebor was born in that hour, though none who sat beside the flames could have foreseen the full scope of what they had set in motion. For in the south, even as they spoke, the forces of darkness were stirring to war, and in the west, a quiet land of green fields and gentle hills would soon be called upon to provide the smallest and most unlikely of heroes. The wheel of fate was turning, and all the peoples of Middle-earth would be caught up in its revolution before the tale was done. Far from the wild lands where dragons slept upon stolen gold, and the shadows of ancient fortresses stretched across the earth, there lay a country so green and peaceful that it seemed almost to exist in a different world entirely. The Shire basked in the gentle light of autumn, its rolling hills adorned with the gold and russet of turning leaves, its roads winding between fields where the harvest had been gathered, and barns stood full to bursting with the fruits of honest labor. Here, in this blessed corner of Middle-earth, the troubles of the wide world seemed as distant as the stars themselves. The hobbits who dwelt in their snug holes and comfortable farmhouses knew little of wars and darkness, of dragons and sorcerers, and the machinations of powers beyond their understanding. Their concerns were smaller, more immediate: the weather and the crops, the state of the roads, and the latest gossip from the markets, the endless question of whether young Bungo Baggins would ever work up the courage to propose to fair Belladonna Took. It was to this land of peace and plenty that Gandalf's thoughts turned as he made his way westward from his meeting with Thorin, his mind heavy with the weight of plans that would soon shatter the tranquility of many lives. The wizard had walked the roads of the Shire for decades, welcomed in every home and beloved by children who knew him as the bringer of fireworks and wonderful tales. Yet now he came not as a friend of leisure, but as one bearing a burden that would test the very foundations of hobbit nature. The road that led to Hobbiton wound between hedgerows, heavy with blackberries, and fields where sheep grazed beneath the watchful eye of their shepherds. Smoke rose from 100 chimneys, carrying with it the scent of baking bread and roasting meat, of pipeweed and wood smoke, and all the comfortable smells of home. As Gandalf crested the hill that looked down upon the village, he paused to drink in the sight of it. This place where time seemed to move more slowly, where the urgent needs of the moment could be set aside in favor of a second breakfast or an afternoon nap in the garden. Yet even here, the wizard's keen eyes could detect subtle signs of the darkness that was stirring in the world beyond. The birds flew restlessly, as if driven by some unease they could not name. The very air seemed to hold a tension, a sense of waiting that had nothing to do with the changing of the seasons. And in the distance, barely visible against the western sky, dark clouds gathered that spoke of storms to come. It was near the hour of evening tea when Gandalf approached the round green door of Bag End, that most respectable of hobbit holes, where dwelt one Bilbo Baggins, confirmed bachelor and gentleman of leisure. The wizard stood for a moment in the garden, remembering the many times he had visited this place in years past, the long conversations by the fire, and the excellent meals that Bilbo's housekeeper never failed to provide. How different this visit would be. How it would change everything that the poor hobbit thought he knew about the world and his place in it. The door opened before Gandalf could raise his hand to knock, and there stood Bilbo himself, a hobbit of middle years, neither young nor old, with the comfortable roundness that spoke of good living and better cooking. His curly brown hair was just beginning to show threads of silver, and his bright eyes held the intelligence of one who read widely and thought deeply, though his thoughts seldom strayed far from the boundaries of his beloved Shire. "Gandalf!" Bilbo exclaimed, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "What a delightful surprise! I was just thinking how dull the evening was becoming, and here you are to brighten it. Come in, come in. You must be tired from your travels. I'll have the kettle on in a moment, and there's seed cake fresh from the oven." The wizard accepted the invitation with gratitude, hanging his hat and staff by the door and following his host into the comfortable sitting room, where a fire crackled merrily in the grate. Everything about the place spoke of contentment and security. The well-stocked bookshelves, the polished furniture, the family portraits that gazed down from the walls with the benevolent expressions of hobbits who had lived long and died satisfied. "You look troubled, my dear Gandalf," Bilbo observed as he bustled about preparing tea and arranging cakes on a silver platter. "Is all well in the world beyond our borders? The last news we had from Bree spoke of strange happenings, wolves seen in broad daylight, and travellers who spoke of lights in the sky where no lights should be." "The world grows dark, my friend," Gandalf replied, settling into his favourite chair by the fire. "Darker than you know, darker than most would believe. There are powers stirring that have slept for centuries, and their waking will bring change to all the lands of Middle-earth, even to this quiet corner where you have made your home." Bilbo poured the tea with hands that were steady despite the wizard's ominous words. It was a sign of his breeding, Gandalf reflected, this ability to maintain the courtesies of hospitality even in the face of disturbing news. Yet beneath the hobbit's calm exterior, the wizard could sense a stirring of something that few of his race possessed, a spirit of adventure that lay buried beneath years of comfortable routine. "Tell me," Gandalf said after accepting his cup with appropriate thanks, "do you ever think of the world beyond the Shire? Do you ever wonder what lies beyond the borders of your maps? What adventures might await one bold enough to seek them?" Bilbo shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and for a moment his gaze turned toward the window where the last light of day was fading into purple dusk. "Sometimes," he admitted, "when I was younger, I used to dream of distant mountains and foreign cities, of treasures hidden in forgotten ruins and tales worth the telling. But that was folly. The dreams of youth that have no place in the life of a respectable hobbit." "Was it folly?" the wizard asked gently. "Or was it perhaps the truest part of yourself, the part that recognizes that there is more to life than comfort and security?" The hobbit was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if seeking answers in their dancing light. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful, tinged with a wistfulness that spoke of roads not taken and chances missed. "My mother was a Took," he said at last. "They say the Tooks have always been different from other hobbits, more restless, more curious about the world beyond their own front doors. Sometimes I wonder if I inherited something of that nature, some spark that makes me dissatisfied with the ordinary course of things." Gandalf leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. "And what does that spark tell you, Bilbo Baggins? What does it whisper in the quiet hours when the rest of the world sleeps?" "That there are things worth seeing beyond these hills," Bilbo replied softly. "That there are deeds worth doing and tales worth living, even if they bring danger and discomfort. That a life spent entirely in safety might be a life not fully lived at all." The wizard smiled, seeing in those words the confirmation of what he had long suspected. Beneath the respectable exterior of this comfortable hobbit lay a heart capable of great courage, a spirit that would not be broken by hardship or daunted by the prospect of danger. Here was the burglar he sought, not a professional thief, but one whose innate decency would prevent him from stealing anything save from the most deserving of victims. "The world has need of such hearts," Gandalf said quietly. "In the days that are coming, the fate of many lands may depend upon the courage of those who seem least likely to possess it. The small may accomplish what the great cannot, and the meek may inherit more than the earth. They may inherit the future itself." Bilbo looked up sharply, some instinct warning him that this was more than idle philosophical discussion. "You speak as one who has something particular in mind, Gandalf. What is it that you would ask of me?" The wizard set down his teacup and regarded his host with the gravity of one who bears the weight of many secrets. "Nothing tonight," he said at last. "Tonight let us speak of lighter things, of books and songs, of the small joys that make life worth living. But tomorrow I may return with companions, and with them a tale that will challenge everything you believe about your own nature and capabilities." The evening passed in pleasant conversation, with Gandalf regaling his host with tales of distant lands and peoples, carefully avoiding any mention of the darker purposes that had brought him to the Shire. Yet beneath the surface pleasantries, both hobbit and wizard were aware of currents running deeper than the spoken word. Currents that would soon sweep Bilbo Baggins into adventures beyond his wildest dreams. As the wizard took his leave and disappeared into the star-filled night, Bilbo stood in his doorway and gazed out at the peaceful landscape of his homeland. Everything was as it had always been. The gardens slumbering beneath the gentle moon, the distant lights of Hobbiton twinkling like earthbound stars, the soft sounds of a countryside at rest. Yet something had changed, some invisible barrier had been crossed, and he knew with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him that his days of quiet contentment were numbered. In the morning, Gandalf would return, and with him would come the first stirrings of the great adventure that would carry a simple hobbit far from his comfortable home and into the very heart of legend itself. The wheel of fate was turning, and Bilbo Baggins, burglar-to-be, would find himself caught up in its revolution, whether he willed it or not. The Shire slept on, peaceful and unaware, but its greatest son was about to step onto the stage of history, and Middle-earth would never be quite the same again. The morning mist still clung to the hollows of the Shire when 13 dwarves made their way along the winding road to Hobbiton, their heavy cloaks and travel-stained gear marking them as strangers in this land of peaceful farmers and comfortable gentlefolk. At their head rode Thorin Oakenshield, his bearing regal despite the simplicity of his dress, while behind him came the companions he had gathered for the great enterprise, warriors and craftsmen, veterans of countless battles and masters of ancient lore. They came by ones and twos, as Gandalf had instructed, taking care not to attract undue attention from the hobbits who tended their gardens and swept their doorsteps in the gentle morning light. Yet even their attempts at discretion could not entirely conceal the weight of destiny that travelled with them, the sense that great events were stirring, and that this quiet valley would soon become the starting point for an adventure that would echo through the ages. Balin the Wise and Dwalin the Warrior, brothers in arms who had stood with Thorin through exile and hardship. Fili and Kili, young and eager, their golden beards bright with youth, and their hearts burning with the desire to prove themselves worthy of their royal uncle's trust. Dori, Nori, and Ori, each bringing skills essential to the quest. The first a master of ancient lore, the second a scout without peer, the third a chronicler who would record their deeds for posterity. Gloin the stout-hearted, and Owen the healer, whose knowledge of herbs and healing would prove invaluable in the trials to come. Bifur, Bofur, and Bomber, kinsmen all, bringing between them the skills of miner, toymaker, and cook. Humble crafts perhaps, but no less necessary for that. And walking among them, his grey robes billowing in the morning breeze, Gandalf the Grey, the architect of all their hopes and the keeper of secrets that would determine the fate of more than one kingdom. As they approached the round green door of Bag End, Thorin found himself wondering once again at the wisdom of his companion's plan. The notion of enlisting a hobbit, any hobbit, but especially one with no experience of the wider world, as their burglar still struck him as madness of the highest order. What could such a creature know of stealth and cunning, of moving unseen through hostile territory and outwitting enemies whose cruelty was legend? Yet Gandalf had been insistent, his arguments compelling in their strange logic. The dragon would expect warriors, would be prepared for assault by sword and axe and spear. But a burglar, a small, quiet creature moving in shadows, might slip past defenses that would hold against an army. And if the worst came to pass, if the quest ended in failure and death, better that it should be in the attempt of something unprecedented than in the repetition of strategies that had already proven inadequate. The wizard had arrived at Bag End before them, as planned, and now the round green door stood open in welcome. From within came the sounds of preparation, the clatter of dishes, the scrape of chairs being arranged, the low murmur of conversation. Whatever else might be said of hobbits, they understood the art of hospitality, and their host was clearly preparing to receive his unexpected guests with all due ceremony. One by one, the dwarves entered the comfortable hobbit hole, each marveling in his own way at the strange architecture and furnishings. To eyes accustomed to the grand halls of Erebor in memory, or the rough shelters of exile in reality, the cozy chambers of Bag End seemed almost toy-like in their proportions. Yet there was a warmth here, a sense of home and hearth that spoke to something deep in the dwarvish nature, the love of craft and comfort, of things well made and carefully tended. Their host proved to be a hobbit of middle years, neither young nor old, with the soft roundness that came from good living and the bright eyes of one who read much and thought deeply. Bilbo Baggins received his guests with the punctilious courtesy of his race, though his growing bewilderment at their number was evident in the way his eyes darted from face to face, trying to count heads and calculate how many he was expected to feed. It was not until they were seated around his dining table, or rather crowded around it, for it had never been designed to accommodate so many, that the true purpose of their gathering was revealed. Gandalf produced from his robes a map of ancient make, its parchment yellowed with age and its edges worn from long handling. As he spread it upon the table, the dwarves leaned forward with reverent attention, for they recognized it as one of the great treasures of their people, a chart drawn by Thror himself in the days of the mountain's glory. "Behold," the wizard said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy, "the map of the lonely mountain, showing the secret ways that were known to the kings of old. Here is marked the hidden door that leads to the lower halls, and here the path that winds to the very chamber where Smaug the Mighty has made his lair." Bilbo peered at the map with the curiosity of one who loved books and learning, but it was clear that its significance escaped him. To his eyes, it was merely an old document covered with strange markings and incomprehensible symbols. Yet the dwarves gazed upon it with the reverence due to a holy relic, their faces shining with a mixture of hope and desperate longing. "This is all very interesting," the hobbit said at last, his voice polite but puzzled. "But I confess I don't quite understand why you're showing it to me. I'm not much of a traveler, you know, and I know nothing of mountains or dragons or whatever it is you're planning." Thorin spoke for the first time since entering the hobbit hole, his voice carrying the authority of one born to command. "We are planning to reclaim our homeland, Master Baggins, to drive out the dragon that has stolen our treasure and restore the kingdom under the mountain to its rightful heirs. And we have need of a burglar to aid us in this endeavor." The hobbit's face went pale, and for a moment he seemed to struggle for words. "A burglar?" he managed at last. "I'm afraid there's been some mistake. I'm not a burglar. I'm a respectable hobbit. I don't steal things. I don't go on adventures. And I certainly don't have anything to do with dragons." But even as he spoke these words of denial, something stirred in the depths of Bilbo's eyes, a flicker of the Tookish spirit that Gandalf had recognized the night before. The wizard saw it and smiled, knowing that the seed had been planted and would grow despite the hobbit's protests. "Yet the signs point to you," Gandalf said quietly. "The moon letters on this map can only be read at certain times, under certain conditions. And they speak of a time that is fast approaching, a time when the last light of Durin's day will reveal the keyhole that leads to the secret door." He produced the key that Thrain had given him, holding it up so that its ancient runes caught the firelight. "This is the key to that door, Master Baggins. It has been lost for 60 years, and only now has it returned to the hands of those who can use it. The signs are clear, the time for action has come, and you are meant to be part of it." The dwarves began to speak then, each adding his voice to the chorus of persuasion. They told of the desolation of Dale, of the families scattered and the treasures stolen. They spoke of Smaug's cruelty, of the terror he spread throughout the north, of the need to rid the world of such a monster. And slowly, inexorably, they wove around the hobbit a web of moral obligation and destiny that grew stronger with each word. Balin unrolled a contract, written in the formal language of dwarvish law, setting forth the terms of Bilbo's employment and the share of treasure that would be his if the quest succeeded. The document was thorough in its provisions, covering everything from burial expenses to the division of spoils, and reading it aloud took the better part of an hour. 1/14th share of the total profits, if any, Balin intoned in his scholarly voice, plus reasonable expenses, to be paid from the common purse. Funeral arrangements to be provided at company expense, should such become necessary. The hobbit listened with growing alarm, his comfortable worldview crumbling as the reality of what was being proposed became clear. These were not figures from a fairy tale come to call. They were serious, determined individuals planning a real and dangerous expedition to face a real and terrible dragon. And they wanted him to go with them. Yet beneath the fear and bewilderment, something else was stirring, a tiny flame of excitement that grew brighter with each detail of their plan. Adventure beckoned, calling to the part of him that had never quite accepted the limitations of respectable hobbit life. The road stretched before him, winding away into unknown lands where anything might happen, and wonders waited to be discovered. It was Gandalf who spoke the final words that tipped the balance, his voice gentle but implacable as the turning of the seasons. "You need not decide tonight, Bilbo Baggins. Sleep on it if you will, but know this, the quest will proceed with or without you. Tomorrow morning, we depart for the Lonely Mountain. If you choose to join us, be at the Green Dragon in Bywater at 11 o'clock sharp. If not, we shall go on without you, and wonder always what might have been." With that, the wizard rose from the table, and one by one, the dwarves followed suit. They filed out into the night air, leaving their host alone with his thoughts and the contract that lay upon his dining table like a gateway to another world. The hobbit hole fell silent, save for the ticking of the clock and the whisper of wind through the trees outside. Bilbo sat for a long time in the dying firelight, staring at the parchment that could change his life forever. The sensible thing would be to throw it in the fire and return to his books and his garden, to the safe, predictable routine that had served him well for 50 years. But the Tookish part of his nature, awakened now and growing stronger by the hour, whispered of different possibilities. In the end, it was neither reason nor prudence that decided him, but something simpler and more fundamental: the recognition that some chances come only once, and that a life lived entirely in safety might be no life at all. As the moon set behind the western hills and the first birds began to stir in the hedgerows, Bilbo Baggins made his choice. The great adventure was about to begin. In the deep places beneath the lonely mountain, where the darkness was absolute and the silence had reigned for 60 years undisturbed, something stirred with the slow majesty of a landslide. The great chamber that had once rung with the voices of dwarf lords and the hammering of countless smiths now served as the lair of Smaug the Mighty, and upon the vast bed of gold and jewels that carpeted its floor, the last of the great fire drakes raised his enormous head and tasted the air with senses that could detect the slightest change in the world above. For weeks now, a restlessness had been growing in the dragon's ancient heart, a stirring that had nothing to do with the turning of seasons or the passage of mortal time. Something was moving in the wide world, something that touched upon matters that concerned him directly. His vast hoard, gathered grain by grain over decades of pillage and terror, seemed somehow less secure than it had been. Enemies walked the earth who bore him ill will, and their plans were approaching fruition. Smaug was no mere beast, despite what the fearful whispers of men might claim. His intelligence was vast and alien, honed by centuries of existence and informed by senses that penetrated far beyond the physical world. He felt the tremors of approaching change as a spider feels the vibrations in its web, and what he sensed filled him with a cold and calculating rage. The dragon rose from his bed of treasure with movements that seemed almost languid, but shook the very foundations of the mountain. Gold coins cascaded from his scales like a metallic waterfall, and precious gems scattered beneath his claws as he stretched his massive frame. Each movement was deliberate, economical, the action of a predator that had never known fear and never accepted the possibility of defeat. His great eye, like a lamp lit with fire from the heart of the earth, turned toward the upper reaches of the mountain where sunlight filtered down through ancient shafts and tunnels. Somewhere up there, beyond the barriers of stone and steel that protected his domain, the world of small creatures continued its frantic dance of life and death, and among those small creatures he sensed were some who dared to think of challenging him. The very notion would have been amusing if dragons were capable of amusement in any sense that lesser beings could understand. What could the brief-lived children of the sun hope to accomplish against one who had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, who had outlived the very stars under which he had been spawned? Their swords were toys, their courage a jest, their treasure, when they possessed any, a pitiful collection of baubles compared to the wealth that he guarded. Yet something had changed in the patterns of the world above, something that spoke to older instincts than mere territorial possession. Smaug closed his great eye and extended his consciousness outward, feeling for the sources of disturbance that had awakened him from his contemplative slumber. There, to the south and west, a gathering of powers that had long remained separate. The wise ones were stirring, the ancient enemies of his true master were beginning to take counsel together. And closer, much closer, something else moved with purpose and stealth. A small company traveling the roads of the wild, their destination unmistakable to one who had spent decades studying the approaches to his lair. They came from the west, following paths that led inevitably to the lonely mountain, and among them were scents and auras that spoke of old grudges and ancient claims. The dragon's lips drew back in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth like swords and a throat that glowed with banked fires. So, the children of Durin had not forgotten their lost kingdom after all. They came again to reclaim what they considered theirs, as if the passage of years had dimmed their memory of his power. Well, let them come. Their bones would make a fitting addition to the foundation of his horde, and their deaths would serve as a reminder to any others who might harbor similar ambitions. But there was something else, something that puzzled even his ancient understanding. Among the approaching company was a presence that he could not quite categorize, something neither dwarf nor man nor elf, but partaking of qualities that seemed almost innocent. It was a strange thing to sense in a company bent on burglary and war, this aura of simple goodness that seemed untouched by the corruption and ambition that drove most who sought his treasure. Smaug raised his great head higher, his nostrils flaring as he tested the air currents that flowed through the mountain's depths. The scent was faint but distinctive, small and warm and oddly comforting, like the smell of baking bread or growing gardens. It spoke of a people who knew nothing of war or conquest, who found their joy in simple pleasures and their strength in the bonds of community. For a moment, something stirred in the deepest recesses of the dragon's memory. A time before the corruption, before the long years of solitude and greed had transformed him into the monster he had become. Once, long ago in the youth of the world, he too had known simpler pleasures. But that time was lost beyond recovery, buried beneath centuries of accumulated malice and the weight of his master's will. The moment passed, and with it any trace of what might once have been mercy. The small creature, whatever it was, traveled with his enemies and shared their purpose. It would die with them when the time came, its innocence no protection against the fires that would consume all who dared to threaten his domain. The dragon began to move through his lair with purpose now, his massive form winding between the pillars of stone that supported the great chamber. He passed the place where the old throne of Erebor had stood, now buried beneath tons of accumulated treasure. He slithered past the forges where the dwarves had once worked their wonders in metal and stone, now cold and silent as the grave. And everywhere he went, the wealth of a kingdom followed in his wake. Gold and silver, diamonds and emeralds, the crafted treasures of a people whose skill would never be matched again. At the heart of his domain, where the greatest treasures were kept, Smaug paused before a pedestal of black marble that rose from the golden sea around it. Upon that pedestal lay a single object, a cup of mithril so pure and perfectly wrought that it seemed to glow with its own inner light. It was the greatest treasure of the Horde, the Arkenstone of Thrain, the heart of the mountain itself. The dragon coiled himself around the pedestal like a great serpent, his burning gaze fixed upon the jewel that had once been the symbol of dwarvish kingship. In its faceted depths, he could see reflections of the past and shadows of things to come. The stone had been lost to its makers for 60 years, but its power remained undiminished. The power to unite the scattered peoples of the north, to forge alliances that might threaten more than just a single dragon's horde. As Smaug contemplated the Arkenstone, he became aware of another presence stirring in the darkness beyond the boundaries of Middle-earth. A will that was vast and malevolent and altogether too familiar. His true master was awakening as well, roused by the same disturbances that had broken the dragon's slumber. The time of hiding was ending, the age of shadow was beginning, and all the careful plans laid down over decades were approaching their fulfillment. "My faithful servant," came a voice that spoke without words, reaching across the miles to touch the dragon's mind with fingers of ice and fire. "The hour approaches when all our enemies will move against us. Are you prepared to play your part in the great work?" Smaug's response came not in words but in images, visions of fire and destruction, of cities burning and armies fleeing in terror before his wrath. The necromancer's laughter echoed through his mind like the sound of breaking glass, cold and beautiful, and utterly without mercy. "Good," the voice continued. "Let them come to you, my faithful one. Let them believe they have a chance of success. And when they are trapped within your domain, when all their plans have brought them nothing but death, then you will know what to do." The presence withdrew, leaving Smaug alone with his thoughts and his treasure. But the dragon was no longer still, no longer content to lie upon his bed of gold and dream of past conquests. His enemies were coming, drawn by prophecy and desperation, to attempt what armies had failed to accomplish. They would learn, as so many had learned before them, that the fire of Smaug was not easily quenched. In the depths of Erebor, where no light of sun or moon had penetrated for 60 years, the dragon began to prepare for war. The mountain itself seemed to tremble with anticipation, and from its highest peak, a thin column of smoke began to rise, the first such sign in decades that the lonely mountain was no longer truly lonely. The fire had awakened, and Middle-earth would soon feel its wrath once more. While the dragon stirred in his mountain fastness, and brave hearts prepared for the quest that would lead them into legend, darker stirrings troubled the eastern reaches of Middle-earth. In the shadow of the mountains of ash, where the very stones were stained black with ancient malice, the fortress of Barad-dûr began to show the first signs of renewed life. No longer did its towers stand empty against the sullen sky. No longer did silence reign in its halls of iron and flame. The Dark Tower rose like a poisoned spear thrust up from the heart of Mordor, its walls black as the void between the stars and its gates sealed with bars of adamant that no mortal weapon could break. For centuries it had stood thus, a monument to fallen power and a warning to all who would challenge the dominion of the free peoples. Yet now, in the deepest chambers where no light had penetrated since the fall of Gil-galad, things moved that should have remained forever bound. In the uppermost spire of the tower, where once the lidless eye had kept its vigil over all the world, a red glow began to kindle. Faint at first, barely visible against the perpetual dusk that shrouded Mordor, but growing stronger with each passing day. The eye was not yet reformed. The will that had once commanded armies numbering in the millions was not yet ready to manifest in its full terror. But the process had begun, and across the length and breadth of Middle-earth, those with the sight to perceive such things felt the stirring of a malice beyond mortal comprehension. Far to the south, in the jungle realm of Near Harad, the mouth of Sauron rode among the scattered tribes with words of promise and threat. A tall man he was, though man he might barely be called, for the years of service to his dark master had changed him into something that partook more of shadow than of flesh. His face was hidden behind a mask of steel, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of one who had looked upon the face of ultimate evil and found it fair. "The time of waiting draws to a close," he proclaimed to the assembled chieftains, his words echoing strangely in the humid air. "Long have your people dwelt in the margins of the world, counted as nothing by the lordlings of the north. But the Dark Lord remembers those who have served him faithfully, and when his kingdom is restored, you shall have your reward." The promises he made were seductive in their scope. Wealth beyond imagining, dominion over the lands of their ancient enemies, the chance to ride in triumph through the streets of Minas Tirith and plant their banners upon the walls of the White City. Some among the chieftains listened with growing excitement, their eyes bright with avarice and old hatred. Others held back, remembering tales their grandfathers had told of the last time such promises had been made and the price that had been paid when they proved false. But the mouth was patient, as his master had taught him to be. He had time, not the brief span allotted to mortal concerns, but the vast expanse of years that was the inheritance of those who served the undying malice. One by one, the holdouts would be won over or eliminated, and when the call came to march north, the men of Harad would answer with spear and sword, and the great beasts that were their particular terror. Meanwhile, in the frozen waste beyond the Sea of Rhûn, another servant of darkness walked among the wild men who dwelt in that desolate region. The Easterlings had always been more willing allies than the Southrons, for their lands lay closer to the source of the shadow, and they had felt its influence for generations uncounted. Yet even their loyalty required tending, their courage bolstering against the day when they would be called upon to face the armies of the West. The emissary who moved among them bore no name that could be spoken in any mortal tongue, for he was one of the Nazgûl, the ringwraiths, who had once been kings of men, but were now something altogether more terrible. His form was hidden beneath black robes that seemed to drink in light, and where he passed, the very air grew cold, and the hearts of brave men turned to water within them. Yet to the Easterlings, he brought not terror, but inspiration, for they had long since learned to love the darkness more than the light. He spoke to them of destiny and conquest, of the weakness of the Western kingdoms and the certainty of victory. He showed them visions of Gondor in flames, of the white tree withered and dead, of their own warriors feasting in the halls of the stewards, while their enemies wept in chains. "The old alliances are crumbling," the wraith whispered, his voice like the wind through a graveyard. "Rohan grows weak, torn by internal strife, and the burden of protecting borders that stretch too far. Gondor stands alone, its armies scattered and its people demoralized by the weight of defeats yet to come. When we strike, we will face not a united front, but a collection of isolated fortresses, each fighting only for itself." The words were carefully chosen, calculated to appeal to the particular vanities and grievances of his audience. To some, he spoke of the injustices done to their ancestors by the kings of Gondor. To others, he painted pictures of the wealth that lay waiting in the treasuries of Minas Tirith. And to all, he offered the most seductive promise of all, the chance to be on the winning side when the final reckoning came. In the dungeons of Dol Guldur, where Thrain had so recently languished in captivity, other prisoners now took his place. Men and elves who had ventured too close to the fortress, dwarves who had been captured while searching for their lost king, even a handful of the great eagles who had been snared by nets of shadow and dragged down from their eyries in the high peaks. All served a purpose in the necromancer's great design, for through them he gathered intelligence of his enemies' movements and intentions. The torture chambers echoed with screams that would have driven lesser men to madness, but to the servants of the Dark Lord, they were music sweeter than any symphony. Each cry of pain was a note in the greater composition that their master was orchestrating. Each broken will another instrument added to his vast orchestra of despair. Yet it was not merely cruelty that drove these torments, but necessity of a sort that only the utterly evil could understand. The necromancer's power was growing, but it was not yet strong enough to stand openly against the combined might of his enemies. He needed time, and time could be bought with information, knowledge of troop movements and supply lines, of the strengths and weaknesses of those who would oppose him. From the lips of a captured ranger of the north, he learned of the growing unrest in Eriador, of goblins stirring in the misty mountains, and wolves running in packs larger than any seen in living memory. An elf lord of Lothlorien, broken by weeks of torment, revealed the routes by which messages passed between the scattered strongholds of his people. A dwarf from the Iron Hills, his spirit finally crushed by the weight of hopelessness, spoke of the defences that Dane Ironfoot had prepared against the coming war. Each fragment of intelligence was carefully catalogued, each piece of the puzzle fitted into its proper place. When the time came to strike, the Dark Lord would know exactly where to aim his blows for maximum effect. His enemies thought themselves secure behind their walls of stone and steel, but he would show them that no barrier could stand against the patience and cunning of ultimate evil. In the pits beneath Isengard, where Saruman the White pursued his own dark researches, the forges burned day and night as a new breed of orc was brought forth to serve in the coming war. These were not the crude, brutish creatures that had served in the armies of old, but something more refined, more deadly. They could endure the light of the sun without pain, could think and plan with something approaching true intelligence, could forge weapons and armor that rivaled the work of elven smiths. The White Wizard surveyed his creations with satisfaction, seeing in them the answer to the military problem that had plagued the forces of darkness for so long. Numbers alone had never been enough to guarantee victory. Discipline, coordination, and superior equipment were required to defeat the armies of the West. His Uruk-hai would provide all three, and when they marched to war, they would do so under banners that bore not the eye of Sauron, but the white hand of Saruman. For the chief of the Istari had plans of his own, ambitions that went beyond mere service to his former master. The ring of power was stirring somewhere in the world, its influence growing stronger with each passing day. When it was finally revealed, there would be a struggle for its possession that would determine the fate of all Middle-earth. And in that struggle, Saruman intended to be not a servant, but a master, not a tool, but the hand that wielded it. Yet for now, the pretense of cooperation must be maintained. The necromancer believed that his fellow wizard was still a faithful ally, still committed to the vision of a world remade in darkness. Let him think so, for the truth would be revealed soon enough. When the final battle was joined and the ring lay within reach, then would come the time for the White Wizard to show his true colors. From the Tower of Orthanc to the dungeons of Barad-dûr, from the southern deserts to the eastern wastes, the servants of Shadow made their preparations for the war that would end all wars. Armies gathered, weapons were forged, alliances were struck, and betrayals planned. The pieces were moving into position on the great board of Middle-earth, and soon the game would begin in earnest. In Osgiliath, Faramir stood upon his walls and watched the eastern horizon, unaware of the vast machinery of destruction that was even now preparing to roll forward and crush everything he held dear. In the Shire, Bilbo Baggins packed his belongings for an adventure that would change his life forever, not knowing that his small quest was but one move in a game whose stakes encompassed the freedom of all thinking beings. The blade of destiny had not yet been drawn from its sheath, but already its edge was being honed to a keenness that would cut through the very fabric of the world. And when it finally fell, none would be able to say they had not been warned of its coming. The first light of Durin's Day touched the peak of the lonely mountain with fingers of gold and silver, revealing what had been hidden in darkness for 60 years. There, high upon the western face, where no mortal eye had glimpsed it since the dragon's coming, the outline of a door appeared, carved so cunningly into the living rock that only the light of the setting moon at the proper season could reveal its presence. Thorin Oakenshield stood before that ancient portal with the key of his fathers in his trembling hand, while behind him gathered the company that had travelled so far and endured so much to reach this moment. 13 dwarves and 1 hobbit, weathered by months of hardship yet triumphant in their achievement, gazed upon the secret way that would lead them into the heart of their ancestral home. The quest had been long and perilous, marked by battles with goblins in the depths of the misty mountains, by capture and escape in the halls of the Elven King, by the terrors of Mirkwood, where shadow lay thick upon the forest paths. Bilbo Baggins had proven himself a burglar indeed, though not perhaps in the manner that any had expected. His courage growing with each trial, his wit sharpening with each danger faced and overcome. It was the hobbit who had discovered the secret of the thrushes, who had understood the significance of the moon letters when the proper time arrived, and it was Bilbo who now stepped forward as the door swung silently open, revealing a passage that led down into darkness deeper than any night. "The way is open," Thorin said, his voice heavy with emotion. After 60 years of exile, the children of Durin returned to their home. Down they went into the mountain's heart, following passages carved by dwarf lords in the elder days, their way lit by the pale gleam of Orcrist and Sting and the soft radiance that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. The air grew warmer as they descended, and with it came a smell that spoke of vast spaces and accumulated wealth, the scent of gold and jewels and precious things gathered from across the breadth of Middle-earth. They came at last to the great chamber where Smaug had made his lair, and there they found emptiness. The dragon was gone, vanished as if he had never been, leaving behind only the vast hoard that had been the object of his obsession for so many years. Gold lay piled in drifts deeper than a tall man's height, while jewels sparkled like stars in the light of their torches. And at the heart of it all, upon a pedestal of black marble, lay the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain itself, blazing with an inner fire that dimmed all other treasures by comparison. "Where is he?" whispered Balin, his old eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the dragon's presence. "Where is Smaug the Mighty?" It was Bilbo who brought word, returning from his scouting mission with news that filled them all with wonder and growing unease. The dragon was indeed gone, but not by any action of theirs. In the night, while they had slept in their camp beyond the mountain's borders, Smaug had awakened to fury and flown forth to wreak vengeance upon those he believed had sent thieves to steal from his hoard. Lake Town burned that night, its wooden buildings consumed in an inferno that could be seen for miles across the dark waters. The dragon's wrath was terrible beyond description, his fire hot enough to boil the lake itself, and his voice a roar that shattered stone and stopped the hearts of brave men. Yet, in his rage, Smaug had revealed the one weakness that all the armies of Middle-earth had failed to discover. A gap in his armor where a black arrow, shot by one whose aim was true, had found its mark and brought the great worm crashing down into the depths of the long lake. Bard the bowman they called him afterward, descendant of the kings of Dale, and his deed would be remembered as long as men drew breath in the northern lands. Yet his triumph was bitter, for Lake Town was destroyed and its people scattered, left to face the coming winter with nothing but the clothes upon their backs and what poor shelter they could find among the ruins. Word of the dragon's death spread swiftly across the northern lands, carried by ravens and eagles and the swift horses of those who served as messengers to the great lords. Within days, armies were on the march, not one or two, but many, all converging upon the lonely mountain with thoughts of claiming their share of the treasure that lay unguarded within. From the south came the men of Lake Town and Dale, led by Bard himself, seeking compensation for their losses and the ancient treasures that had belonged to their fathers. From the north marched the elves of the woodland realm, their banners bright with silver and green, claiming jewels that had been wrought by their craftsmen in ages past. And from the east came a host that made the earth tremble beneath its tread, the army of Dane Ironfoot, Lord of the Iron Hills, bringing aid to his kinsman Thorin in the hour of greatest need. 3 armies they were, and each with just claims and ancient grievances to support their cause. Yet it seemed that justice would give way to war, that the freedom won with such effort would be lost in bloodshed and bitter strife. Already the banners were planted before the gates of Erebor. Already harsh words had been spoken that could not easily be taken back. It was then that Gandalf returned, riding hard from the south, with news that cast all their quarrels into shadow. The wizard's face was grim with knowledge of approaching doom, and his words carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "You gather here to dispute over treasure," he said to the assembled lords. "While in the darkness beyond your sight, a greater army makes ready to fall upon you all. The goblins of the misty mountains march by night, led by Bolg of the north and Azog the Defiler, their ranks swollen by every foul creature that serves the shadow. They come not for gold or jewels, but for blood and revenge. And if you stand divided when they arrive, you will all perish together." The Battle of Five Armies, as the singers would name it in later days, was fought beneath the shadow of the lonely mountain as autumn gave way to winter. Goblins and wolves, wargs and trolls, creatures spawned in the darkness of Angband itself, poured down from the grey mountains like a black tide. Against them stood the hastily forged alliance of men and elves and dwarves, their differences set aside in the face of a common threat. The fighting was fierce and desperate, victory swinging back and forth like a pendulum, as first one side and then the other gained the advantage. Heroes fell that day whose names would be remembered with honor. Brave men of Dale who died defending their ruined city. Elven lords who gave their lives to protect the retreat of their people. Dwarf warriors who sang ancient songs as they charged into the ranks of their foes. Thorin himself fought like a king of old, his sword Orcrist gleaming as it carved a path through the enemy host. Yet in the end, it was the arrival of unexpected allies that turned the tide. The great eagles of the Misty Mountains, led by their lord Gwaihir, and with them one who bore the staff of power and commanded the very elements themselves. Gandalf had not come alone from the south. With him rode one whose presence sent terror into the hearts of the enemy. Beorn the Skin Changer, greatest of his kind, who took the form of a great bear and swept through the goblin ranks like a force of nature itself. Behind him came the men of his household, grim warriors who knew no fear and asked no quarter from any foe. The victory was complete when it came, the goblin army broken and scattered to the four winds. Yet it was bought at a price that would be felt for generations to come. Thorin Oakenshield, king under the mountain, fell mortally wounded in the hour of triumph, struck down while defending the gates of his reclaimed kingdom. With his last breath, he made peace with those he had quarreled with, his pride at last humbled by the nearness of death. "There is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West," he said to Bilbo, who knelt beside the dying king with tears upon his cheeks. "Some courage and some wisdom, blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world." With Thorin's death, the kingship passed to his cousin Dain, who proved himself worthy of the crown, both in battle and in the councils that followed. The treasure was divided fairly among all who had just claim to it, with generous portions set aside for the rebuilding of Dale and the succor of Lake Town's refugees. The kingdom under the mountain was restored, its halls once again echoing with the sounds of forge and hammer, of song and laughter and the voices of children learning the ancient crafts of their people. Yet even as the dwarves celebrated their homecoming, wise eyes looked eastward with growing concern. The Battle of Five Armies had been won, but it was merely the first skirmish in a war whose scope was greater than any yet imagined. From the wreckage of the goblin host, survivors fled to carry word of their defeat to their dark masters. And in the shadows beyond the light of Erebor's forges, malevolent powers began to stir more openly than they had for centuries. The dragon was dead, the mountain reclaimed, the kingdom restored. But the greater darkness was only beginning to gather its strength. And soon, very soon, all the free peoples of Middle-earth would be called upon to stand together against a shadow that threatened to swallow the world. In the halls of Erebor, where the Arkenstone blazed with renewed splendor upon the throne of the Mountain Kings, Dane Ironfoot set about the great work of restoration. Yet he did so with one eye always turned toward the south, where smoke rose from the peaks of Mordor and the very stones seemed to whisper of approaching doom. The kingdom had been reclaimed, but the price of keeping it was yet to be paid. In the deepest caverns beneath the misty mountains, where the roots of the world ran down into darkness older than memory, something stirred that had lain hidden for centuries, beyond the counting of mortal years. The goblin town above had fallen silent, its tunnels choked with rubble and its halls echoing with the cries of the dispossessed. But in the black depths below, where even the orcs feared to venture, an ancient evil felt the first stirrings of its master's awakening will. Gollum crouched beside the dark pool that had been his home and his prison for age upon age, his pale hands trailing in the cold water as he searched for the fish that were his only sustenance. But today the hunt brought him no joy, for a great unease had settled upon his twisted heart, an unease that spoke of loss and longing and a precious thing that was no longer where it should be. "Gone, gone," he whispered to himself, his voice echoing strangely in the cavern's depths. "The precious is gone, yes, stolen by the nasty burglar, the thief, the trickster. We knows it is gone, but we doesn't know where, does we, precious?" For 60 years the ring had been his companion, his comfort, his obsession. It had preserved his wretched life far beyond its natural span, had granted him power over the creatures of darkness, had whispered to him in the lonely hours of its beauty and its might. And now it was gone, taken by a small creature that had wandered into his domain during the chaos of the goblin battle, won from him in a game of riddles whose outcome still filled him with rage and despair. The creature, Bilbo the burglar had called himself, had vanished into the upper world, carrying with him the one thing that gave Gollum's existence meaning. For months now, the wretched creature had searched the tunnels and chasms of the mountain's depths, hoping against hope that the ring had been dropped or discarded somewhere in the darkness. But it was not to be found, and with each passing day, the certainty grew stronger that it was truly lost to him. Yet as he crouched beside his pool in the endless night, Gollum began to sense something that filled his blackened heart with a mixture of hope and terror. The ring was stirring, awakening from whatever slumber had kept it hidden from his awareness. Its influence was growing stronger, its call more insistent, and with it came knowledge that he had not possessed before. "My precious grows powerful," he thought, his bulbous eyes gleaming with malevolent light. Yes, it remembers its true master. It does. It wants to come home to us, to its Gollum, its love. But first it must wake, must remember what it is, what it can do. The ring's awakening was not a gentle thing. Across the breadth of Middle-earth, those with the wisdom to perceive such matters felt the stirring of a power that had slept since the foundations of the world were laid. In Rivendell, Elrond raised his head from ancient scrolls and felt a chill touch his heart. In Lothlorien, Galadriel looked up from her mirror and saw shadows moving in its depths. And in the Grey Havens, Círdan the shipwright paused in his work and gazed eastward with eyes that had seen the first rising of the sun. But it was Gandalf who felt the awakening most keenly, for he alone among the wise had suspected the truth about the simple gold ring that Bilbo had claimed to have found. The wizard was riding south from Erebor when the first wave of the ring's influence washed over him like a tide of ice and fire, and he knew with sudden, terrible certainty that all his fears had been justified. The One Ring, he thought, his hands tightening on Shadowfax's reins until the great horse whinnied in protest. It was in the Shire all along, carried by the most innocent of creatures, hidden in the last place that any would think to look. And now it stirs. Now it seeks to return to its master's hand. The wizard urged his mount to greater speed, racing across the wild lands toward the borders of the Shire with an urgency born of desperate need. if his suspicions were correct, and the growing pressure in his mind told him they were, then the simple gold band that Bilbo carried was no mere trinket, but the greatest weapon ever forged by the enemy. And if that were true, then all their victories, all their careful plans, all their hopes for the future hung by the slenderest of threads. Meanwhile, in the comfortable sitting room of Bag End, Bilbo Baggins sat in his favourite chair and turned the ring over and over in his weathered hands. It felt heavier today than it had in years past, more significant somehow, as if it were awakening from a long sleep. The gold seemed to pulse with its own inner warmth, and when he held it up to the firelight, he could swear he saw letters appearing on its surface, letters in a script he did not recognize, written in lines of fire that hurt his eyes to look upon. Strange, he murmured to himself, slipping the ring back into his pocket where it had rested for so many years. I don't remember it doing that before. The hobbit tried to return to his reading, but the words on the page seemed to dance and blur before his eyes. A restlessness had settled upon him, a longing for things he could not name. The walls of his comfortable home felt confining, the familiar rooms strange and unwelcoming. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees with a voice that seemed almost human, and shadows moved across his windows in patterns that suggested watching eyes. It was then that the first whisper came, so faint that at first he thought it was merely the wind, but growing stronger and more insistent with each repetition. A voice speaking in a language he did not understand, yet somehow the meaning was clear. Come to me. Return what was taken. Come home. Bilbo rose from his chair and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness that lay beyond his garden. There was nothing to see but the familiar shapes of trees and the hedgerows, yet he could not shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to make a choice whose consequences would echo through all the ages of the world. The ring pulsed in his pocket like a second heartbeat, warm against his leg and heavy with a weight that had nothing to do with gold. For a moment, just a moment, he considered taking it out, slipping it onto his finger as he had done so many times during his adventure. The power it granted was intoxicating, the ability to move unseen through the world like a ghost among the living. But something held him back, some instinct deeper than conscious thought that warned of danger in that simple act. Instead, he drew the curtains closed and returned to his chair, though sleep would not come to him that night, nor for many nights thereafter. Far to the east, in the growing darkness of Dol Guldur, the necromancer felt the ring's awakening like music in his ears. For centuries he had searched for it, sending his servants to scour every corner of Middle-earth for the tiniest trace of its presence. And now, at last, it revealed itself, not lost forever in the depths of Anduin as he had feared, but safe in the hands of one who knew not what he carried. Soon, he whispered to the shadows that served as his court, soon it will remember its purpose, will call to those who serve me. And when it does, we shall follow that call to its source and reclaim what was stolen from us in the hour of our defeat. But the necromancer was not the only one who felt the ring stirring. In his tower of Orthanc, Saruman the White raised his head from his books and scrolls, his eyes blazing with sudden understanding. He too had suspected, had wondered at the tales told by the dwarves of their burglars' strange invisibility. And now the truth was revealed in all its terrible glory. The Ring of Power was real, was found, was awakening to its true nature, and whoever possessed it when it achieved full consciousness would wield a weapon capable of challenging even the might of the Dark Lord himself. The White Wizard's lips curved in a smile that held no warmth, and his thoughts turned to plans within plans, to the possibility of claiming ultimate power for himself. In the depths beneath the misty mountains, Gollum felt the stirring too, and his wails of anguish echoed through the empty tunnels until even the hardiest of the deep-dwelling creatures fled from the sound. The ring was waking, was remembering, was calling to him across the miles, with a voice that promised reunion and revenge. "We will find it," he whispered, his voice sharp with desperate hunger. "We will find the thief, the burglar, the nasty creature that stole our precious. And when we does, oh yes, when we does, we will make it pay. We will make it tell us where the precious is, and then we will takes it back. Yes, takes it back to keep forever and always." The hunt was beginning, though few yet realized it. The ring that had slept in innocence for 60 years was stirring to wakefulness, and with it would come a choice that would determine the fate of all Middle-earth. For the greatest weapon ever forged could not remain hidden forever, and when it finally revealed itself in all its power, the world would tremble at its passing. In the Shire, where peaceful hobbits tended their gardens and lived their quiet lives, shadows were gathering that would soon shatter the tranquility of ages. The storm was coming, and at its heart lay a simple band of gold, whose true nature would test the courage and wisdom of all who encountered it. The ring still slept, but its dreams were growing darker with each passing day. And when it finally awakened, nothing in Middle-earth would ever be the same again. The assault upon Dol Guldur came as the first snows began to fall upon the northern reaches of Mirkwood, when the trees stood bare and black against the grey sky, and the very air seemed thick with the breath of winter. For weeks the forces of the White Council had gathered in secret, moving through the dark paths of the forest like shadows within shadows, their purpose known only to the wisest among the Eldar and the most trusted of their allies. Gandalf rode at their head, his grey robes replaced with robes of white that gleamed like starlight in the gloom, for his true nature was revealed at last to those who had eyes to see. No longer was he merely the grey pilgrim who walked the roads of Middle-earth, but Gandalf the White, Mithrandir in truth, one of the Maiar sent from the Undying Lands to contest the will of the Shadow. Behind him came Elrond and his sons, Elladan and Elrohir, their faces stern with the weight of ancient grievances, and with them rode Glorfindel of the House of the Golden, Flower, whose sword had tasted the blood of Balrogs in the elder days. From Lothlorien came Celeborn the Wise and a company of the Galadrim, their cloaks grey as morning mist, and their eyes bright with the light of Erendil's star. Lady Galadriel herself was not among them, for her power was needed elsewhere, to hold the borders of her realm against the darkness that pressed ever more closely, and to look into her mirror for signs of what was to come. The fortress of Dol Guldur loomed before them as they approached, its twisted spires clawing at the sky like the fingers of a giant buried beneath the earth. The very air around it seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and the ground beneath their feet was black and barren, poisoned by centuries of evil habitation. No bird sang in the blighted trees that surrounded the hill. No flower bloomed in the shadow of its walls. Yet, as they drew near, Gandalf felt a stirring of unease that had nothing to do with the obvious perils of their task. Something was wrong, not with their plan, which had been carefully laid and thoroughly discussed, but with the fortress itself. The malevolent presence that should have pressed against their minds like a weight of lead was absent. Not gone entirely, but diminished, as if its attention were turned elsewhere. "He knows we are coming," Elrond said quietly, his ageless face troubled by the same perception. "The necromancer has withdrawn the greater part of his power, leaving only lesser servants to guard his stronghold." Gandalf nodded grimly, understanding the implications all too well. Sauron, for that was surely who the necromancer was, had never intended to make his final stand at Dol Guldur. The fortress had served its purpose as a base for gathering intelligence and corrupting the surrounding lands, but with the ring's awakening, greater matters demanded his attention. He was returning to Mordor, to the Black Tower that was his true seat of power, and preparing for the war that would decide the fate of all Middle-earth. Still, the assault must proceed. Even diminished, Dol Guldur remained a canker in the heart of the Free Lands, a source of corruption that would spread its poison far and wide if left unchecked. The servants left behind were powerful in their own right. Nazgul and orcs, trolls and worse things that had no names in the tongues of the wise. They would not yield their master's stronghold without a fight that would test the courage of even the greatest warriors. The battle began at dawn, though no sun pierced the perpetual gloom that shrouded the hill. Elven horns sang their clarion call across the wasteland, and the host of the White Council advanced with banners flying and swords gleaming like silver fire. Against them came the servants of darkness, wave after wave of orcs pouring from the fortress gates, their ranks reinforced by trolls whose hide was tough as stone and whose strength could shatter armor with a single blow. Glorfindel led the charge, his sword blazing with a light that had not been seen in Middle-earth since the fall of Gondolin. Where he rode, the enemy fell like wheat before the scythe, their screams of terror echoing across the battlefield as they fled from one whose very presence was anathema to their corrupted nature. Behind him came the sons of Elrond, their twin blades carving a path through the chaos, while overhead the great eagles swept down to strike at the winged shadows that served as the necromancer's scouts. But it was Gandalf himself who struck the telling blow, his staff blazing with the flame of Anor as he strode up the winding path that led to the fortress gates. The doors were wreathed in shadow and bound with spells of great power, but before the White Wizard's might they crumbled like sand before the tide. Into the halls of Dol Guldur he went, and with him came a light that had not shone in those cursed chambers since they were first raised. The darkness fled before him like mist before the morning sun, and one by one the servants of the necromancer fell or fled. In the deepest dungeon, where Thrain had so recently languished, Gandalf found the prisoners who had been taken in recent years. Men and elves, dwarves, and even a few of the great eagles, all reduced to shadow and despair by their long captivity. Yet at the touch of his light, hope kindled in their hearts once more, and strength returned to limbs that had known only weakness. At last, the wizard came to the throne room where the necromancer had held court, and there he found not the Dark Lord himself, but one of his chief servants, a wraith clad in black robes whose very presence made the air itself recoil. The Witch King of Angmar stood before the empty throne, his blade drawn and wreathed in flames that gave no warmth. "So," the Nazgul hissed, his voice like the wind through a charnel house, "the White Council sends its champion to contest with the servants of the true king. Know that you come too late, wizard. My master has departed for his ancient seat, and even now the foundations of Barad-dûr tremble with his returning power." "Then let him tremble in turn," Gandalf replied, his staff blazing with renewed fire, "for he has awakened powers that he thought safely bound, and the choices of the smallest among us may yet prove his undoing." The battle that followed shook the very foundations of Dol Guldur, light clashing against darkness in a struggle that transcended the merely physical. Spell met, counterspell, flame answered flame, and the ancient stones themselves cried out in agony as forces beyond mortal comprehension warred within their halls. In the end, it was not strength of arm that decided the contest, but purity of purpose. The White Wizard's dedication to the cause of freedom proving stronger than the Witch King's service to tyranny. The Lord of the Nazgul fled at last, his form dissolving into shadow and mist as he sought escape from the blazing presence of his enemy. But his words echoed in the empty throne room long after he had vanished. "You have won nothing, wizard. My master has what he sought, and the time of reckoning draws near." As the last of the enemy fled or fell, the host of the White Council swept through the fortress like a cleansing flame. The dungeons were opened and their prisoners freed. The instruments of torture were cast down and broken. The black altars where sacrifices had been offered to the Dark Lord were overthrown, and their stones scattered to the four winds. Yet even as they celebrated their victory, the leaders of the assault knew that they had won only a respite, not a true triumph. Dol Guldur was cleansed, its power broken for the time being, but the greater shadow had merely withdrawn to gather its strength elsewhere. The necromancer's true purpose had been served. The northern lands were weakened by decades of his malign influence. The free peoples divided and uncertain. Their attention turned toward threats that paled beside the storm that was even now gathering in the east. "We have driven back the darkness," Elrond said as they stood among the ruins of the fortress, watching smoke rise from the pyres where the servants of evil burned, "but we have not destroyed it. Like water flowing around a stone, it has found another path, another way to achieve its ends." Gandalf nodded. His eyes turned toward the distant peaks that marked the borders of Mordor. Already he could see the red glow that spoke of fires rekindled, of forges working day and night to arm the hosts that would soon march forth. The real war was beginning, and this victory at Dol Guldur would soon be forgotten in the face of trials that would test the courage of all who loved freedom. "The enemy withdraws," the White Wizard said quietly, "but he does not retreat. He gathers his strength for a final assault that will either break our resistance forever or see his own power shattered beyond recovery. The time of half measures is ending, and soon all must choose their side in the struggle that will decide the fate of the world." As they departed from the ruins of Dol Guldur, setting fire to what remained of its evil works, the members of the White Council carried with them the bitter knowledge that their victory was but the prelude to a greater and more terrible conflict. The shadow had been driven from its northern stronghold, but it lived still in the hearts of its servants and the will of its master. And in the darkness of Mordor, where the fires of Mount Doom had begun to burn with renewed fury, the Dark Lord prepared for the war that would end all wars, the final contest between light and shadow that would determine whether Middle-earth would remain free or fall forever beneath the dominion of evil. The enemy had withdrawn, but he would return. And when he did, all the free peoples of the world would face their ultimate test. The winter that followed the cleansing of Dol Guldur was long and bitter, marked by storms that seemed to carry more than mere cold upon their wings. In Osgiliath, Faramir stood once more upon the walls that had become his second home, watching the eastern sky where clouds gathered like an army marshalling for war. The city had changed in the months since Gandalf's visit. Its defenses strengthened, its garrison increased, its people girded for trials that all could sense approaching, but none could fully comprehend. The Prince of Ithilien was no longer the young captain who had first spoken with the Entwife in the gardens, though the seasons that had passed could be counted on one hand. The weight of command had settled upon his shoulders like a mantle, and in his grey eyes lay depths of wisdom that came only to those who had looked upon the face of ultimate evil and found the courage to stand against it. Word had reached them of the great victory in the north, of Erebor reclaimed and Smaug the Mighty cast down, of the battle of 5 armies where the free peoples had stood together against the darkness. Yet Faramir understood, as perhaps few others did, that these triumphs were but the first movements in a symphony of war whose final notes had yet to be written. Behind him, in the council chamber where maps were spread and plans laid, Mablung and the other captains spoke in low voices of the reports that came daily from the borders. Orc raids were increasing in both frequency and boldness, striking at farms and settlements that had known peace for generations. The ancient watchtowers of Ithilien, long abandoned, were being garrisoned once more by creatures that served the shadow. And from the direction of the Morannon came the sound of marching feet and the clash of arms being forged. "My lord," came a voice at his elbow, and Faramir turned to see one of his rangers approaching with the measured tread of one who bears news of weight. It was Damrod, a scout whose skill was legendary even among that elite company, and his weathered face bore the marks of long watching in dangerous places. "What word from the eastern borders?" the prince asked, though he could read much already in his subordinate's bearing. "The crossroads are taken, my lord," Damrod replied grimly. "The great statue of the king has been overthrown and defiled, its head replaced with that of an orc chieftain. The roads that once carried merchants and pilgrims now echo with the tread of enemy patrols." Faramir nodded, unsurprised by the news, though it struck his heart like a physical blow. The desecration of the ancient monument was more than mere vandalism. It was a declaration of intent, a sign that the enemy no longer felt the need for stealth or subtlety. The time of open war was at hand. "And what of the hidden hall?" he asked, referring to the secret refuge where his rangers had long maintained their watch upon the lands beyond the river. "Still secure, my lord, though we dare not venture far from its concealment. The very air grows thick with malice, and creatures walk abroad that were not made for the light of the sun. Yet we keep our vigil, and our arrows still find their mark when the need arises." As Damrod departed to see to his duties, Faramir remained upon the wall, his thoughts turning to all that had transpired since that night when the necromancer's voice had whispered in his chamber. The wizard's words had proven prophetic. Choices made by the smallest among them were indeed shaping the course of great events. A simple hobbit's courage had helped reclaim a kingdom, while a dragon's death had freed the northern lands from the shadow of terror. Yet even greater choices lay ahead, and Faramir found his thoughts turning often to the mysterious ring that Gandalf had spoken of, the weapon that the enemy sought above all others, the key to either ultimate victory or final defeat. Somewhere in the wide world, that simple band of gold waited for the hand that would claim it, and upon that choice would hang the fate of all who loved freedom. The prince was not alone in his vigil. Across the breadth of Middle-earth, other watchers kept their own lonely guard against the gathering darkness. In Rohan, Theoden King sat in his golden hall and felt the weight of years pressing upon his shoulders, while around him his knights polished their weapons and spoke of the glory that awaited those who died in defense of their people. In Lothlorien, Galadriel gazed into her mirror and saw visions of fire and shadow, of cities fallen and people scattered, but also of small lights that burned steadily in the darkness, refusing to be quenched. In the Grey Havens, Círdan the shipwright prepared ships for a voyage that might never come, while his heart grew heavy with the knowledge that the time of the elves in Middle-earth was drawing to a close. Whether in victory or defeat, the age that was ending would not see its like again, and those who survived the coming war would inherit a world forever changed. And in the Shire, where the first signs of spring were beginning to show in the hedgerows and gardens, Bilbo Baggins sat in his study and wrote the final chapters of his great adventure. The book would be his gift to posterity, his way of ensuring that the courage of ordinary folk would not be forgotten in the tales of kings and wizards. Yet as he wrote, the ring lay heavy in his pocket, its influence growing stronger with each passing day. The hobbit had aged little in the years since his return from Erebor, though those with eyes to see might have noticed that he seemed somehow less substantial than before, as if part of him were already walking other roads in distant lands. The ring preserved him, sustained him, but at a price that he was only beginning to understand. Soon, very soon, he would have to make a choice that would test not only his courage, but his very soul. Faramir thought often of these distant allies and enemies, of the vast web of relationships and obligations that bound the free peoples together. The enemy sought to divide them, to turn kingdom against kingdom, and people against people, until they stood isolated and vulnerable. But the bonds forged in the fires of shared adversity were not easily broken, and already word was spreading of new alliances being formed, new oaths being sworn. From Rohan came promise of aid should Gondor's need become desperate. From the north came word that the dwarves of Erebor would not forget their debt to those who had helped them in their hour of greatest peril. Even the elves, who had long withdrawn from the affairs of mortal men, were stirring to new action, as they recognized that their own fate was tied to the outcome of the war to come. Yet it was not in grand alliances or mighty armies that Faramir placed his greatest hope, but in the quiet courage of ordinary folk, the farmers who would leave their ploughs to take up swords, the merchants who would risk their lives to carry messages through hostile territory, the simple folk who would offer shelter to refugees and comfort to the wounded. For in the end, it was not the great who would determine the outcome of the war, but the small, those whose names would never be sung in halls of kings, but whose deeds would echo through all the ages of the world. As the sun sank behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Faramir made his way down from the walls to the chamber where his captains waited. There was much work to be done, defenses to strengthen, supplies to gather, plans to make for the trials that lay ahead. Yet he carried with him a certainty that had grown stronger with each passing day, that no matter how dark the hours became, no matter how desperate their circumstances might appear, there would always be those willing to stand against the shadow. The fire of hope burned still in the hearts of the free peoples, a flame that no darkness could extinguish as long as courage remained. It burned in the forge halls of Erebor where dwarf smiths worked to arm their allies. It burned in the golden halls of Rohan, where riders prepared for war. It burned in the hidden refugees of the rangers, in the councils of the wise, in the quiet homes where ordinary folk lived lives of simple decency and unsung heroism. And it burned brightest of all in the most unlikely places, in the heart of a hobbit who had found that he was braver than he knew, in the hands of those who would bear unimaginable burdens, in the choices that would be made by the smallest and seemingly weakest among them. The darkness was gathering, vast and terrible and seemingly insurmountable. But against it stood the light of hope, fed by the small acts of courage that made the darkness tremble. And in that light, Faramir found the strength to face whatever trials lay ahead, knowing that he did not stand alone. In Osgiliath, as in 100 other places across Middle-earth, the watch continued. The fire burned on, quiet and steady and unquenchable, a beacon to all who loved freedom, and a promise that the darkness, however mighty, would not have the final word. For in the end, hope was the greatest weapon of all. Hope, and the small hands that would wield it. Thus ends the tale of The Last Stand of Faramir, the prince who defied death at Osgiliath, wherein are told the first stirrings of the great war that would decide the fate of all Middle-earth. Yet this was but the beginning of trials greater still, when small folk would be called upon to bear burdens beyond the strength of kings, and the smallest deed would turn the tide of the mightiest battles.